Human history preserves not only the memory of the rise of civilizations, but also the traces of their sudden disappearance. Stone cities, underground galleries, sunken complexes, and undeciphered texts remain silent witnesses to knowledge ahead of its time. This scenario addresses real-life archaeological mysteries, where scientific facts intertwine with unanswered questions, forming a map of lost ancient worlds. The disappearance of the Harappan culture. The Harappan civilization, or Indus Valley civilization, was one of the most advanced cultures of the ancient world. It developed in the Indus River Valley and the adjacent territories of modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India. Its heyday occurred in the 3rd millennium BCE. Archaeological discoveries have shown that the Harappans created a sustainable urban system based on rigorous planning, engineering expertise, and a social order that still evokes wonder. Harappan cities were distinguished by a clear structure. Streets intersected at right angles. Blocks were divided into residential and public areas, and houses were built of standardized fired brick. Almost every dwelling had a water drainage system connected to an underground sewer system. This level of sanitation was rare in the ancient world and indicates sophisticated concepts of hygiene and social organization. Public buildings were particularly important. The so-called Great Pool, likely used for ritual ablutions, was discovered at Mohenjo-Daro. Nearby were warehouse complexes and platforms that could have served as resource distribution centers. All this suggests a complex economy and the presence of institutions coordinating urban life, although no direct evidence of authority in the form of palaces or temples has been discovered. One of the greatest mysteries of Harappa remains its writing. Short inscriptions on seals and tablets consist of symbols whose meaning remains unknown. The lack of longer text deprives researchers of the opportunity to reconstruct mythology, laws, or historical chronicles. As a result, the civilization seems to exist without a voice, leaving only material traces of its activities. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the Harappan urban culture began to gradually decline. Archaeological layers reveal a decline in the quality of construction, the disappearance of complex engineering solutions, and a population decline in major centers. Cities did not collapse suddenly, but seemed to slowly empty out, losing their former significance and function. Climate change is considered one of the most widely discussed causes of this process. Geological and paleoclimatic studies point to weakening monsoons and changing precipitation patterns. If agriculture, based on regular river flooding, became less reliable, this could have led to food shortages. Under such conditions, supporting large cities became increasingly difficult. Changes in river courses may have played an equally important role. There is evidence that some waterways that previously supplied settlements dried up or shifted over time. For a civilization closely linked to the river system, this meant the loss of transportation routes, water sources, and fertile land. Resettlement of the population to more favorable areas may have been a necessary survival strategy. Previously, there was a theory that an invasion by outside tribes supposedly led to the destruction of Harappa. However, modern research does not confirm widespread destruction or evidence of violence. On the contrary, the archaeological picture suggests a gradual transformation of society. The population did not disappear, but rather changed its way of life, moving from urban centers to smaller settlements. Internal social causes are also possible. A complex system of governance and resource distribution could have become vulnerable to environmental and economic changes. The loss of centralized control would have led to the disintegration of a unified urban culture into local communities. Such processes rarely leave clear traces of catastrophe, but they can radically alter the face of civilization. Interestingly, the Harappan culture did not disappear without a trace. Elements reminiscent of its traditions are found in later archaeological layers of the region. This applies to pottery forms, construction methods, and individual symbols. Perhaps the descendants of the Harappans became part of new societies, preserving fragments of their previous knowledge, but losing the scale and complexity of their urban system. The disappearance of Harappa demonstrates that the collapse of civilizations isn't always linked to wars or sudden catastrophes. Sometimes, slow, almost imperceptible changes in the environment and social structure play a decisive role. In the case of Harappa, we see an example of how a highly organized society can gradually fade into history, leaving no written record of its demise. Today, the ruins of the Harappan cities stand as a reminder of the fragility of even the most advanced systems. Their silent streets and deserted houses prompt reflection on how closely the fate of civilization is tied to nature and society's ability to adapt to change. This is why the disappearance of the Harappan culture remains one of the key and most instructive mysteries of the ancient world. The riddle of Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa is one of the most enigmatic and underappreciated sites of the ancient world. This archaeological complex is located in the western Egyptian desert, far from the Nile Valley, in a region that today seems completely uninhabitable. However, several millennia ago, there was sustained human activity here, the traces of which turned out to be much more complex and sophisticated than researchers expected. The first discoveries at Nabta Playa were made in the second half of the 20th century. Archaeologists discovered the remains of settlements, stone circles, laid slabs, and carefully oriented structures. Radiocarbon dating revealed that many of these structures predate the famous megaliths of Europe and predate the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. This immediately changed our understanding of the capabilities of prehistoric societies in North Africa. During its heyday, Nabta Playa was a seasonal hub of activity. The Sahara climate was significantly wetter then, and lakes and savannas existed where the desert now stands. People came here during the rainy seasons, grazing livestock, hunting, and likely performing rituals associated with natural cycles. Evidence of fire pits, pottery, and storage pits confirms a long-term organized human presence. Nabta Playa is best known for its stone circles and vertical steles. Some of these form precise geometric shapes and are oriented to the cardinal points. Researchers have noted that certain lines align with the directions of sunrise on the solstices. This suggests that the complex was used as a primitive astronomical observatory. If these interpretations are correct, Nabta Playa could be considered one of the earliest known examples of systematic astronomical observations. People without writing or sophisticated instruments were able to record the rhythms of celestial bodies and incorporate them into stone architecture. This suggests a developed abstract thinking and the ability to transmit knowledge from generation to generation. In addition to stone circles, underground ritual pits containing the remains of cattle have been discovered at Nabta Playa. These burials are distinguished by their precision and repetitiveness, indicating the animal's cultic significance. Cattle likely played a key role not only in the economy, but also in the worldview of the region's ancient inhabitants, being associated with ideas of fertility and renewal. Of particular interest is the question of the social structure of the Nabta Playa people. The construction of large stone structures required coordinated efforts, planning, and collective discipline. This suggests that the society already possessed elements of hierarchy or at least recognized authorities capable of directing collaborative work. Such structures rarely arise by chance and are usually associated with the development of religious or calendrical practices. Over time, the region's climate began to change rapidly. Lakes dried up, rains became increasingly rare, and the savanna gave way to desert. Nabta Playa gradually lost its importance as a center of seasonal life. People were forced to abandon these lands and seek more stable sources of water and food. However, the mystery remains: where exactly they went and what became of their knowledge. Many researchers suggest that part of the population migrated to the Nile Valley. If so, the traditions that originated at Nabta Playa could have influenced the formation of early Egyptian culture. The ideas of sacred orientation of structures, the cult of celestial phenomena, and the ritual significance of animals find distant parallels in later Egyptian beliefs. However, direct evidence of this continuity is still lacking. The lack of written sources and the time gap make any conclusions hypothetical. Nevertheless, the very possibility that the roots of Egyptian civilization extend to the depths of the prehistoric desert gives Nabta Playa special significance in human history. The mystery of Nabta Playa lies not only in its stone circles, but also in the level of thinking of the people who created them. They lived in a world where nature dictated harsh conditions, yet they managed to develop a complex system of orientation in time and space. This was not simply a matter of survival, but an attempt to understand the world around them and their place in it. Today, Nabta Playa remains little known to the general public, but for archaeologists and historians, it is key to understanding the early stages of human civilization. This complex demonstrates that long before the emergence of cities and states, people already possessed knowledge that required observation, memory, and collective organization. The disappearance of Nabta Playa as a center of life does not mean the disappearance of its legacy. The stones left in the desert continue to testify that the origins of complex cultures can lie in places that today seem empty and lifeless. This is why Nabta Playa remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of the ancient world and a powerful reminder of the depth of human history. Lost records of the Mayans. The Maya civilization created one of the most complex and developed writing traditions of pre-Columbian America. Their hieroglyphic system was capable of conveying not only numbers and names, but also abstract concepts, historical events, mythological stories, and astronomical calculations. However, only a tiny fraction of this written heritage has survived, making the lost Maya records one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Mayan writing was used for many centuries and was widespread. Texts were inscribed on stone steles, temple walls, ceramics, and special books crafted from tree bark. These books, known as codices, contained calendars, ritual prescriptions, astronomical tables, and likely historical chronicles. They represented the civilization's concentrated repository of knowledge. The arrival of the Spanish brought disaster to the Mayan written tradition. In the 16th century, missionaries seeking to eradicate indigenous beliefs systematically destroyed texts, considering them to be carriers of pagan cults. The most famous episode was the book burning in Yucatan, when hundreds of codices were consigned to the flames. This event deprived humanity of a vast amount of information accumulated over many generations. Only a few authentic Mayan codices have survived to this day. They are housed in European libraries and museums and are named after their location. Even these fragments demonstrate astonishingly accurate astronomical observations, complex calculations of time cycles, and profound symbolic thought. One can only speculate about the knowledge contained in these lost books and the completeness of the Mayan worldview. Besides codices, other forms of written records existed. Stone inscriptions on stelae often commemorated rulers, important dates, and religious events. However, even here we encounter losses. Many monuments were destroyed, reused for construction, or engulfed by the jungle. Entire chapters of the history of the Mayan city-states disappeared along with these inscriptions. The decipherment of Mayan writing only became possible in the second half of the 20th century. Before then, scholars understood only the calendrical and numerical parts of the texts. When it became clear that the hieroglyphs conveyed a complete language, it became possible to decipher names, dynastic chronicles, and descriptions of events. However, deciphering them only highlighted the scale of the losses, as many texts turned out to be fragmentary or ended at the most interesting points. Lost Mayan records are also important because they could offer an alternative view of the region's history. Spanish chronicles describe civilization through the eyes of their conquerors, often distorting or simplifying its reality. The Mayas' own texts could have revealed the causes of wars, internal crises, religious reforms, and intercity relationships. Without them, the historical picture remains incomplete. Astronomical knowledge likely occupied a special place in the lost records. The Maya closely observed the movements of the planets, especially Venus, and linked celestial cycles with terrestrial events. The surviving tablets are striking in their precision and systematicity. It can be assumed that the lost texts contained even more detailed models of time, possibly incorporating philosophical notions of fate and the renewal of the world. The loss of written sources has also led to a distortion of ideas about Mayan religion. Archaeology allows us to reconstruct images of gods and rituals, but without texts, it is difficult to understand their meaning. Records could explain myths, the origins of the world, and the roles of humans and gods. Instead, researchers are forced to reconstruct beliefs from indirect evidence, comparing images, architecture, and later oral traditions. Interestingly, the Maya themselves recognized the value of written knowledge. Scribes held a high position in society, and learning to write required extensive training. This suggests that texts were perceived as the foundation of cultural memory. The destruction of books represented not just a loss of information, but a rupture in the connection between generations, the consequences of which are still felt today. There are suggestions that some of the texts may have been hidden or survived in remote areas. However, archaeological finds have not yet confirmed the discovery of new codices. The Mesoamerican climate is extremely unfavorable for the preservation of organic materials, so the likelihood of miraculous preservation of the books is slim. Nevertheless, the very hope of such discoveries continues to attract researchers. The lost Mayan records symbolize the fragility of human knowledge. A highly developed writing system capable of storing complex ideas was almost completely destroyed in a short period of history. This reminds us how easily cultural memory can be erased when a society loses the ability to protect its symbols and texts. Today, the study of the surviving fragments continues. New analytical methods, digital image processing, and interdisciplinary research make it possible to extract maximum information from the surviving inscriptions. Each deciphered sign represents an attempt to gain insight into the knowledge that was irretrievably lost. The mystery of the lost Mayan records lies not only in what they contained, but also in the scale of the loss. Here we have an example of a civilization whose intellectual world was almost completely destroyed, leaving behind only fragments of meaning. These fragments continue to speak, but their voices are muffled, a reminder of how many secrets the past still holds. Labyrinth of Havar. The Hawara Labyrinth is considered one of the most enigmatic architectural complexes of ancient Egypt. Its descriptions come down to us primarily from ancient sources, primarily the works of Herodotus and Strabo. They claimed that this structure surpassed even the pyramids in scale and complexity. The labyrinth was located next to the pyramid of Pharaoh Amenemhat III in the Fayum Oasis and served not just as a building, but as a special sacred and administrative center. According to ancient authors, the labyrinth of Hawara consisted of numerous courtyards, halls, and corridors, all interconnected into a single system. Herodotus wrote of thousands of chambers, half of which were underground. He emphasized that the structure was so complex that a person without a guide could easily get lost. This gave rise to the idea of the labyrinth as a symbol of hidden knowledge and inaccessible power. Modern archaeological evidence confirms that a vast complex did indeed exist in Hawara. Remains of foundations and fragments of limestone slabs indicate a monumental structure occupying a significant area. However, most of the building was dismantled in ancient and medieval times when the stone was reused. Therefore, the labyrinth's true appearance can only be reconstructed from indirect evidence. The purpose of the Hawara labyrinth remains a matter of debate. One theory suggests that it served as an administrative center, housing archives, courtrooms, and priestly quarters. Another theory links the labyrinth to funerary and ritual functions, considering it part of a complex cult associated with the afterlife and the pharaoh's divine authority. The mention of underground levels is particularly interesting. Egyptian architecture rarely included such extensive underground spaces outside of burial complexes. If ancient descriptions are accurate, the underground sections of the labyrinth could have been used to store ritual objects, mummies of sacred animals, or documents of special significance. This part of the complex remains virtually unexplored. Some researchers suggest that the Hawara labyrinth may have been a symbolic reflection of the state structure. The complex system of halls and corridors could have represented the nomes of Egypt and their interconnections. In this case, the labyrinth became an architectural model of the country, where each element had a strictly defined place and function. This corresponded to the Egyptian concept of the world as a harmonious yet hierarchical system. Interestingly, the image of the labyrinth later appeared in Greek culture. The Cretan labyrinth, associated with the myth of the Minotaur, may have been inspired by tales of Hawara. Greek travelers may have transferred impressions of the Egyptian structure into their own mythology, transforming a real architectural phenomenon into a symbol of trial and mystery. Archaeological exploration of Hawara began in the 19th century. Fragments of walls, column bases, and traces of paved courtyards were discovered. However, high groundwater levels and dense urban development make large-scale excavations difficult. Many suspected underground structures remain inaccessible, further enhancing the aura of mystery surrounding the labyrinth. Modern methods, such as geophysical surveys, have revealed subsurface anomalies that may correspond to the remains of corridors and halls. These findings confirm that the complex was far more complex than the surviving ruins suggest. However, a complete reconstruction of the labyrinth is still impossible, and much of the information remains hypothetical. The Hawara labyrinth is significant not only as an architectural marvel, but also as a reflection of the intellectual level of the Middle Kingdom. Its construction required precise calculations, labor organization, and a profound understanding of space. This demonstrates the high level of engineering development and the ability to manage large-scale projects at the state level. The disappearance of the labyrinth as a complete structure also presents a mystery. It wasn't destroyed suddenly, but gradually disappeared, dismantled for building material. This suggests a shift in priorities and the loss of the complex's sacred significance in later eras. When function disappeared, so did respect for form. Today, the Labyrinth of Hawara exists on the border between history and legend. We know it was real, but we cannot see it as the ancients did. Its image is formed from fragments of texts, archaeological remains, and scientific reconstructions. It is precisely this incompleteness that makes the labyrinth so captivating to researchers. The enigma of the Hawara labyrinth lies in the combination of scale and loss. Before us lies an example of a structure once considered the greatest in the world, now almost completely vanished, leaving behind only a shadow of its former glory. It is a reminder that even the most grandiose creations can fade into time if the memory of their meaning fades. Derinkuyu Underground City. The Derinkuyu Underground City, located in central Cappadocia, is considered one of the most astonishing engineering feats of antiquity. Its existence only became publicly known in the second half of the 20th century, when a local resident accidentally discovered a hidden passage in his home. Beyond it, a whole world of corridors, halls, and shafts opened up, extending deep beneath the Earth's surface. It turned out that beneath this ordinary settlement lay a multi-level underground complex capable of accommodating thousands of people. Derinkuyu was carved from the soft volcanic rock typical of Cappadocia. This material was easy to work, yet still retained its strength and stability. The creators of the underground city utilized the natural properties of the stone to create spaces for various purposes. Living quarters, storage areas, kitchens, temples, animal stables, and even wineries have been discovered here. Such diversity suggests that Derinkuyu was intended not as a short-term shelter, but as a long-term residence. One of the city's most impressive features is its depth. According to various estimates, Derinkuyu descends 8 or more levels, reaching tens of meters underground. Each level was connected to the others by a system of narrow corridors and staircases that could be easily sealed off. Stone discs, used as doors, allowed for the isolation of individual sections in case of danger. This indicates a sophisticated defense and access control system. The ventilation system is particularly noteworthy. Vertical shafts were discovered in the underground city, providing a supply of fresh air even at the deepest levels. Some of these shafts were also used as wells. This type of engineering demonstrates a high level of knowledge and practical experience. Without reliable ventilation, prolonged stay underground would have been impossible, especially for large numbers of people. The question of when Derinkuyu was built remains open. Some suggest that the first levels may have been carved out in ancient times, possibly during the Hittite era. However, most of the visible structure dates to later periods when the underground cities were actively used by early Christian communities. For them, Derinkuyu served as a refuge from the persecutions and raids that frequently rocked the region. The underground city was part of a larger network. Several dozen similar complexes are known in Cappadocia, some of which were interconnected by tunnels. This suggests an entire underground infrastructure designed for a coordinated use. In the event of a threat, the population could move between shelters without being detected by the outside world. Derinkuyu's purpose goes beyond simple shelter. The presence of cult spaces and spacious halls suggests that religious ceremonies and gatherings were held here. Subterranean life shaped a unique worldview, combining security and isolation with collective discipline. People living in such conditions were required to strictly adhere to rules that ensured the survival of the entire community. Interestingly, Derinkuyu bears no obvious signs of catastrophic destruction. The city was not suddenly buried or abandoned in a single event. Rather, its use likely declined gradually as the political and social environment shifted. Once the need for hidden habitation disappeared, people returned to the surface, leaving the underground world empty. Many hypotheses surround the underground city. Some researchers suggest that such complexes could have been used not only for defense, but also as a means of population control. Life underground required adherence to a strict regime and limited contact with the outside world. In this sense, Derinkuyu can be seen as a unique social experiment realized in stone. The scale of the work raises no less questions. Creating such a city required a tremendous amount of labor and time. This suggests that the project was backed by an organized community with access to resources and knowledge. The underground city could not have been the work of a single era or a single generation. It evolved and was rebuilt over centuries, reflecting changing needs and threats. Today, Derinkuyu is open to the public, but only a portion of its levels are accessible. Many corridors remain closed for safety reasons or due to insufficient exploration. This leaves room for future research and new discoveries. Modern technology offers hope that the hidden sections of the underground city will reveal more about the past than we currently know. The Derinkuyu underground city is striking not only for its size, but also for the very idea of life underground. It demonstrates how flexibly humans can adapt to the dangers of the surrounding world. Instead of abandoning the region, people chose to transform the space, turning the Earth's interior into a fully functioning habitat. The enigma of Derinkuyu lies in its combination of rationality and mystery. On the one hand, its structure is logical and practical. On the other, it remains unclear how often and under what conditions people actually lived here permanently. The underground city seems to exist between extremes, simultaneously a refuge and a fully fledged settlement. In historical perspective, Derinkuyu becomes a symbol of the hidden layers of the past. It reminds us that beneath the familiar surface of history, entire worlds can be hidden, created in response to people's fears and hopes. This underground city continues to provoke questions about the limits of human ingenuity and what other secrets might lie beneath the earth, waiting to be discovered. Stone platforms of Nan Madol. Nan Madol is one of the most unusual archaeological complexes on the planet. Located off the east coast of the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, it consists of a system of artificial islands connected by canals. It is often called the Venice of the Pacific, but this comparison only partially captures the scale and strangeness of the structure. The stone platforms of Nan Madol were erected in a location lacking the resources typically needed for monumental construction, making the complex's origins a subject of considerable debate. The complex consists of more than 90 artificial islands, each with clearly defined boundaries and stone walls. These walls are made of massive basalt blocks laid in a distinctive lattice. The stones are shaped like elongated prisms and weigh several tons. Their transportation and placement without the use of metal, wheels, or draft animals raises serious questions among researchers. Nan Madol was built on a coral reef directly above the water. To create the platforms, a foundation of coral rubble was first laid, then reinforced with stone blocks. This method required precise calculations and an understanding of water and tide patterns. A design error could have led to the collapse of the entire platform. Nevertheless, the complex survived for centuries, demonstrating the high level of engineering skill of its creators. According to local legend, Nan Madol was the capital of the Sodalur dynasty, which ruled the island of Pohnpei for several centuries. The stone platforms served as residences for nobles, temples, tombs, and administrative centers. Each part of the complex had its own purpose, and travel between the islands was accomplished by boat along canals. This created a closed and strictly controlled environment. Ritual platforms occupied a special place. Ceremonies associated with power, ancestors, and likely natural forces were held on them. Some islands were used exclusively for burials, emphasizing the sacred nature of the entire complex. The stone platforms were not simply residential structures. They formed a space where power and religion merged. The mystery of Nan Madol is heightened by the question of the origin of the basalt blocks. The quarries are located a considerable distance from the complex, and the island's terrain does not facilitate the easy transport of heavy stones. It is unclear how thousands of tons of basalt were transported to the construction site. Some hypotheses suggest the use of rafts, levers, and collective labor, but no direct evidence of such technologies has been found. The scale of the project is no less astonishing. The construction of Nan Madol could not have been the work of a single generation. It required long-term planning, a stable social structure, and the ability to mobilize large groups of people. This means that Pohnpei society at this time was significantly more organized than is commonly believed for oceanic cultures. Over time, Nan Madol was abandoned. The reasons for this demise remain a subject of debate. According to one theory, the Sodalur dynasty lost power and the new ruling class abandoned the old sacred center. Another hypothesis attributes the decline of the complex to environmental problems. Life on artificial islands required a constant supply of food and fresh water, making the system vulnerable. Climate change could also have played a role. Rising sea levels or changing storm patterns could have made life on Nan Madol less safe. Stone platforms designed for specific conditions could have gradually become unstable. In such a situation, relocation to more sheltered areas of the island seemed a logical step. Archaeological research shows that the complex was not completely forgotten after the elite's departure. Local residents continued to visit it, but with a different attitude. Nan Madol became a place of memory and taboo. Stories of punishment, violation of taboos, and the wrath of ancestors were associated with it. This suggests that the complex's sacred status persisted even after its political function had been lost. For researchers, Nan Madol represents a rare example of stone architecture in a region where organic materials predominated. Its platforms challenge conventional notions about the development of island societies. They demonstrate that even in isolated environments, complex and large-scale construction projects comparable in ambition to those of continental civilizations could arise. Nan Madol has been the subject of much speculation. It is sometimes called a sunken city, though most of the platforms have always been above water. Others link it to a lost civilization or external influence. However, archaeological evidence points to a local origin for the complex, emphasizing the uniqueness of Pohnpei's cultural trajectory rather than its dependence on external sources. The stone platforms of Nan Madol are also important because they demonstrate a different approach to spatial organization. Unlike cities with streets and squares, everything here is built around water. Canals serve not only as communication routes, but also as elements of division and control. This created a unique social geography where access to certain areas was strictly limited. The disappearance of Nan Madol as a functioning center remains a mystery with no definitive answer. Several factors may have played a role: political upheaval, environmental challenges, and a shift in worldview. In any case, the abandonment of such a large complex was not sudden, but a gradual process accompanied by a rethinking of its significance. Today, the stone platforms of Nan Madol stand amid mangroves and canals, a reminder of a time when this archipelago was a center of power and ritual. Their silent massiveness is impressive, especially considering that the exact history of their creation remains unknown. Nan Madol remains one of those sites where archaeology confronts the limits of interpretation. The stones speak of labor, power, and faith, but they don't reveal all their meanings. This complex reminds us that even in the most remote corners of the world, people created complex structures that reflected their ideas about order, the sacred, and power. This is why the stone platforms of Nan Madol continue to hold a special place among the greatest mysteries of ancient architecture. Sunken Complex of Yonaguni. The Yonaguni Sunken Complex is one of the most controversial and debated underwater sites of our time. It is located off the southern shores of the Japanese island of Yonaguni at a depth of several dozen meters and was discovered relatively recently. Despite this, it has already earned a special place among archaeological mysteries, balancing on the line between a natural formation and a possible ancient man-made structure. The first reports of strange stone formations appeared in the late 20th century, when divers noticed unusually smooth surfaces and sharp angles underwater. Subsequent exploration revealed a massive structure resembling a stepped platform with terraces, stairs, and straight edges. The complex's dimensions are impressive. Individual elements reach tens of meters in length and height, creating the impression of a monumental architectural structure. The complex's geometry is the most controversial. Many surfaces appear remarkably smooth, and the angles are nearly right angles. Some sections resemble steps leading upward, while others resemble wide platforms, as if intended for gatherings or rituals. Such shapes are difficult to explain by random erosion, leading to hypotheses of human intervention. Proponents of Yonaguni's artificial origin point to the presence of symmetry and repeating elements. They note that such large-scale structures with a clear orientation and stepped structure are rare in nature. Furthermore, stones with holes and grooves were discovered near the complex, which some researchers interpret as signs of processing. However, there is also an opposing view. Many geologists believe Yonaguni is the result of natural processes. They believe the layered structure of the local rocks, combined with tectonic activity and marine erosion, could have led to the formation of smooth surfaces and angles. The volcanic origin of the stone causes it to split along straight lines, which could create the illusion of man-made structures. The debate is complicated by the complex's underwater location, which significantly limits the possibilities for large-scale research. Underwater conditions make precise measurements, excavations, and contextual analysis difficult. As a result, most conclusions are based on visual observations and limited samples, leaving room for varying interpretations. If we accept that Yonaguni is artificial, the next question arises. When was it built? Sea levels in the region have fluctuated significantly over the millennia. The last ice age was accompanied by lower sea levels, and the areas now submerged could have been dry land. This means that the hypothetical construction could have occurred in ancient times, long before the known historical civilizations of Japan. This dating radically changes our understanding of the development of human societies in the region. It suggests the existence of a complex culture capable of constructing large stone structures during an era for which almost no material evidence remains. It is precisely this possibility that makes Yonaguni so attractive to alternative theories and bold reconstructions of the past. Skeptics, however, point to the lack of accompanying finds. No pottery, tools, or other artifacts that would clearly indicate human activity have been discovered around the complex. Context is crucial in archaeology, and its absence seriously weakens the case for artificial origin. Interestingly, the complex itself does not appear complete in the traditional architectural sense. There are no obvious enclosed spaces, traces of residential buildings, or decorative elements. This suggests that even if the structure was created by humans, it may have served a specific function, perhaps ritualistic, symbolic, or related to the observation of natural phenomena. Yonaguni also fits into the broader context of the world's underwater mysteries. All over the globe, submerged settlements and structures are known, having arisen during periods when sea levels were lower. Yonaguni occupies a special place in this context due to its scale and geometry, which distinguish it from other sites. For the local population, the complex has become part of the cultural landscape. It is perceived as evidence of the region's deep antiquity and its connection to the sea. Even without definitive scientific conclusions, Yonaguni already influences the collective imagination, shaping the image of a sunken world hidden beneath the waves. Modern research continues, but progress is slow. New technologies are needed that can map underwater structures in detail and analyze them non-destructively. Perhaps in the future, additional data will be discovered that could tip the scales. For now, Yonaguni remains an open question, not a solved mystery. The significance of Yonaguni lies not only in the site itself, but also in how it demonstrates the limits of our knowledge. It demonstrates the difficulty of distinguishing traces of human activity from complex natural forms, especially when dealing with the distant past and difficult-to-access environments. This complex forces archaeology to continually re-examine its methods and criteria. The sunken complex of Yonaguni remains a place where science and doubt coexist. It offers no definitive answers, but it raises questions that expand the horizons of ancient history research. Whether it turns out to be a work of nature or man-made, Yonaguni has already become a symbol of how many secrets the past still conceals beneath the depths of water and time. Baalbek Massifs. The Baalbek complex in Lebanon is considered one of the most astonishing examples of megalithic construction in human history. Its ruins rise in the Bekaa Valley at a major crossroads of ancient trade routes, and for centuries have baffled travelers, historians, and engineers. Even in its ruined state, Baalbek gives the impression of a place where human ambition collided with the limits of possibility. The most famous part of the complex is the Temple of Jupiter, which retains gigantic columns that significantly exceed the size of most ancient structures. However, the lower part of the platform on which the temple stands is considered even more mysterious. It is here that the famous megalithic blocks are found, the size and mass of which are unparalleled in Roman architecture. At the base of the platform lie the so-called trillions, 3 gigantic stone blocks, each weighing hundreds of tons. They were laid with astonishing precision, without mortar, and form a perfectly aligned line. Their position raises many questions, as such elements play no obvious structural role in the buildings above. This suggests that the platform is older than the Roman temple. Not far from the complex, in an ancient quarry, an even larger block, known as the Pregnant Woman Stone, was discovered. Weighing over 1,000 tons, it remains uncut from the rock. This monolith provides an idea of the scale of the planned construction and the ambition of the ancient craftsmen. However, it also raises a key question. How could such blocks have been moved and installed? The traditional view attributes the construction of Baalbek to the Romans, who indeed possessed advanced engineering and were capable of constructing grandiose structures. However, known Roman construction methods poorly explain the use of such massive stones. Megaliths of such size were not used in other parts of the Roman Empire, making Baalbek an exception even within the Roman architectural tradition. There is a hypothesis that the Romans merely rebuilt or used an older foundation. This theory is based on the stylistic and structural differences between the upper and lower levels of the complex. The lower platform appears rougher, more massive, and lacking decorative elements, while the Roman structures are distinguished by their refinement and strict adherence to traditional design principles. If we accept the pre-Roman origin of the megalithic platform, the question arises about the culture capable of implementing such a project. Historical sources mention the Phoenicians, who worshipped Baal and may have used this site as a sacred center. However, archaeological evidence that the Phoenicians built megaliths of such a scale is still insufficient. Even more daring theories link Baalbek to an unknown or lost tradition of megalithic construction that existed long before classical antiquity. In this context, the complex is sometimes compared to other enigmatic structures around the world that also used giant stone blocks. This comparison doesn't provide direct answers, but it emphasizes that Baalbek is not an isolated phenomenon. The precision of stone processing is of particular interest to researchers. The surfaces of the blocks are remarkably smooth, and the joints between them are minimal. This requires not only physical strength, but also precise measurements, processing skills, and an understanding of geometry. Even modern technology struggles to reproduce such precision when working with such masses. The question of transportation also remains unclear. The quarry is located below the platform level, meaning the blocks had to be lifted upward. Various models have been proposed, including the use of inclined ramps, levers, wooden structures, and a large labor force. However, all these hypotheses face the problem of scalability and the stability of such structures under extreme loads. The function of the megalithic platform also remains a subject of debate. If viewed solely as the foundation of a temple, the use of such gigantic blocks seems excessive. This suggests that the platform may have had a sacred significance in itself, serving as a symbol of stability, strength, and connection to the divine. Baalbek played an important role in the region's religious life for centuries. Various deities were worshipped here, and the site's cult significance persisted even through successive civilizations. This indicates the location's special status, which may have existed long before the arrival of the Romans. Perhaps it was the sacredness of the site that determined the scale and uniqueness of the construction. Over time, the complex lost its original significance. Earthquakes, wars, and the removal of stone led to the destruction of a significant portion of the structures. Nevertheless, even in ruins, Baalbek remains one of the most impressive monuments of antiquity. Its massifs continue to dominate the landscape, a reminder of a time when architecture sought not simply to serve utilitarian purposes, but also to capture the imagination. Modern research at Baalbek faces limitations. Full-scale excavations are difficult, and interpretation of the data is complicated by the complex's multi-layered history. Each new fact raises new questions rather than providing definitive answers. This makes Baalbek an example of an archaeological mystery that defies simple explanation. The Baalbek Massifs are significant not only as an engineering achievement, but also as a challenge to historical models. They force us to reconsider our understanding of the capabilities of ancient societies, their technologies, and motivations. Regardless of who created the megalithic platform, one thing is clear. Its construction required a level of organization and knowledge that went beyond conventional models. Baalbek remains a place where the past is physically felt. Enormous stones, having survived millennia, continue to silently bear witness to a design whose meaning has not been fully lost. It is precisely this combination of grandeur and obscurity that holds the core mystery of the Baalbek Massifs, making them one of the key symbols of the unsolved pages of human history. Underground passages of Serapeum. The Serapeum at Saqqara is one of the most enigmatic structures of ancient Egypt, where the underground space plays a far more important role than the above-ground architecture. From the outside, this complex appears relatively modest, but beneath the surface lies a system of corridors and galleries that is astonishing in its scale and engineering sophistication. It is the Serapeum's underground passages that have raised numerous questions that remain unanswered to this day. The complex was discovered in the 19th century when archaeologists cleared the entrances, which had been blocked by sand. Beyond them, they discovered a long underground gallery extending hundreds of meters into the plateau. On either side of the corridor were niches containing gigantic stone sarcophagi. Even the first glimpse of this space left a strong impression. The precision of its craftsmanship, the strict geometry, and the unusual combination of scale and secrecy. Traditionally, the Serapeum is associated with the cult of the sacred bull Apis. According to ancient Egyptian beliefs, Apis was considered the earthly incarnation of a deity and was accorded a special funeral ritual after death. Each bull received an individual sarcophagus and a ceremonial burial. However, the underground passages of the Serapeum cast doubt on the idea that the complex served only as a burial place for animals. The sarcophagi housed in the gallery niches are striking in their size and weight. They are carved from solid blocks of granite and weigh tens of tons. The interior surfaces are machined with extreme precision, and the lids are so precisely fitted that it's almost impossible to insert a blade between them and the body. This begs the question, why was such complex and labor-intensive engineering required for animal burial? The underground corridors of the Serapeum are distinguished by their strict orientation and repetition. They do not appear to be spontaneously expanded tunnels, but rather part of a pre-planned system. The width of the passages, the height of the ceilings, and the distance between niches are maintained with striking regularity. This suggests a precise design and a lengthy preparatory phase. The depth of the galleries is particularly interesting. The Serapeum is located significantly below the level of the surrounding necropolis. Its construction required the removal of enormous volumes of rock and the stability of the vaults. Moreover, the underground passages lack the decorative features typical of pharaonic tombs. Their austerity and functionality create the impression that they were intended for a limited circle of initiates. The purpose of the underground passages remains unclear. The official version suggests that they were used exclusively for funerary ceremonies. However, rituals associated with Apis could have been performed in more accessible locations. The hidden nature and scale of the underground galleries suggest additional functions beyond the scope of traditional worship. Some researchers note the acoustic properties of the corridors. Sound propagates in the galleries in an unusual way, amplified and reflected by the stone surfaces. This could have been used during rituals, creating the effect of a divine presence. In this case, the underground passages became not just a place to store sarcophagi, but an active element of cultic practice. There's also speculation that the Serapeum served as a kind of repository for knowledge or sacred objects. Its underground location provided protection from the outside world and time. However, archaeological finds do not confirm the presence of written archives or any objects other than sarcophagi. This absence only adds to the sense of uncertainty. The engineering aspects of the Serapeum's construction raised no less questions. Moving granite blocks of such size into the underground space required precise logistics and coordination. The quarries were located at considerable distances, and transporting the blocks through the narrow corridors presented a serious challenge. Modern reconstructions suggest the use of inclined ramps and wooden structures, but no model fully explains the process. It's also unclear how the sarcophagi were installed in the niches with such precision. Some are positioned in such a way that their installation after the corridors were completed seems virtually impossible. This has led to the hypothesis that the sarcophagi were placed first, and then the galleries were carved out around them. This approach would require a different order of work and indicates even more complex planning. The underground passages of the Serapeum do not exist in isolation. They are part of the larger Saqqara necropolis, where subterranean structures played a vital role for millennia. Corridors, shafts, and hidden chambers were used for rituals, burials, and the storage of sacred objects. In this context, the Serapeum can be seen as the culmination of the subterranean architectural tradition. The historical duration of the complex's use also remains a subject of debate. The sarcophagi date to different periods, indicating the Serapeum's long-term use. This suggests that the underground passages were not a one-time project, but were maintained and possibly expanded over generations. This continued use demonstrates the complex's importance to Egyptian religious life. Over time, the Serapeum was abandoned and covered with sand. The reasons for this process are not entirely clear. Perhaps religious beliefs changed, or the cult of Apis lost its significance. However, the fact that the underground passages remained hidden for centuries created an aura of mystery around them, heightening the interest of modern researchers. Current research at Serapeum is limited. Many areas remain closed or poorly explored. High humidity, unstable rock, and difficult access hinder detailed exploration. This means that much information about the underground passages may be lost or still hidden beneath layers of rock and sand. The underground passages of the Serapeum challenge conventional understandings of Egyptian architecture. They demonstrate that ancient masters devoted enormous attention to hidden spaces. These spaces were not intended to display power or beauty, but rather played a key role in the culture's ritual and symbolic system. The mystery of the Serapeum lies not so much in its appearance as in the combination of factors that are difficult to pin down to a single function. The scale, concealment, engineering precision, and lack of direct explanation make the underground passages an object that straddles the line between archaeology and the philosophy of religion. The Serapeum prompts reflection on the role the underworld played in the consciousness of the ancient Egyptians. Perhaps it was underground, far from sunlight, that the most important transitions between the world of the living and the world of the gods took place. In this case, the underground passages were not simply an architectural element, but a space of transformation and sacred experience. Today, Serapeum remains one of those places where every new fact generates even more questions. Its underground galleries remain silent, leaving researchers with only stone walls and strict geometry as clues. It is precisely this silent complexity that makes Serapeum one of the deepest and most unsolved mysteries of ancient Egypt. Stone spheres of Costa Rica. The Costa Rican stone spheres are among the most enigmatic archaeological sites in the Americas. Discovered in the southern part of the country, in the Diqui River Delta, they immediately attracted attention due to their shape, scale, and complete lack of obvious practical purpose. These perfectly round stone spheres, some reaching over 2 meters in diameter and weighing tens of tons, have no direct parallels among pre-Columbian monuments. The first discoveries were made in the mid-20th century during land clearing for banana plantations. Workers encountered massive stone objects partially buried in the soil. Many had been moved from their original locations, which subsequently complicated scientific study. Nevertheless, even in their disturbed state, the spheres were striking in their geometric precision. The material from which the spheres are made also raises questions. Most of them are carved from hard volcanic rock, quarried at considerable distances from their find sites. This means that ancient craftsmen not only shaped the stone to near-perfect shapes, but also transported the heavy pieces across difficult terrain without the use of wheels or draft animals. The manufacturing technology of the spheres remains unclear. Surface processing traces are minimal, making it difficult to definitively identify the tools used. It is believed that the stone was worked by gradual chipping and polishing, possibly with the use of heating and cooling. However, achieving such symmetry required either exceptional skill or a lengthy and carefully controlled process. Archaeologists associate the stone spheres with the Diquis culture, which existed in what is now Costa Rica, long before the arrival of Europeans. This culture also left behind settlements, burial mounds, and stone platforms. However, none of the known sites contain written or pictorial indications directly explaining the sphere's purpose. They seem to be out of context with the overall material culture of the region. The original arrangement of the spheres is particularly interesting. Some were arranged in groups or in lines and geometric shapes. This suggests intentional placement, possibly linked to social or ritual functions. However, due to displacement and destruction, only partial records of the exact arrangements were possible. It is hypothesized that stone spheres were used as symbols of power or status. Their creation required significant resources and collective labor, making them accessible only to the elite. In this case, the spheres could have marked settlement centers, chieftaincy domains, or sites of important ceremonies. Their shape, devoid of sharp edges, could have symbolized the integrity and stability of the world. Other researchers suggest an astronomical or calendrical purpose for the spheres. The regularity of their shapes and the possible orientation of some groups have led to speculation about a connection with solar or stellar observations. However, convincing evidence of such a function has not yet been found. Unlike megalithic complexes in other regions, the spheres are not accompanied by clear landmarks or markers. The lack of a utilitarian function makes the stone spheres particularly enigmatic. They were not used as building elements, did not serve as tools, and had no obvious ritual decoration. Their value lay precisely in their form. They are a rare example of abstract geometry becoming a central element of material culture. After the arrival of Europeans, many spheres were damaged or destroyed. Believed to contain treasures, the stone spheres were often broken or blown up. These actions caused irreparable damage to the archaeological context and deprived researchers of vital information about the object's original use. In the 20th century, attitudes toward the spheres changed. They began to be perceived as national heritage and a symbol of Costa Rica's ancient history. Some were transferred to museums, universities, and public spaces. However, this removal further separated the objects from their original environment, turning them into isolated artifacts. Modern research is attempting to reconstruct the lost context using comparative analysis and geophysical methods. The distribution of the spheres, their sizes, and their relationship to other Diquis culture sites are being studied. These data allow for cautious speculation, but do not provide definitive answers. The stone spheres of Costa Rica challenge simplistic notions of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican societies. They demonstrate the presence of complex aesthetic and symbolic concepts not directly related to utilitarian needs. This suggests a developed abstract thinking and the ability to imbue meaning into form. The question of continuity poses a particular mystery. After the disappearance of the Diquis culture, the tradition of creating stone spheres was not continued. None of the later cultures in the region left behind similar objects. This points to the uniqueness of the phenomenon and the possible connection of the spheres to a specific social or religious system that disappeared along with its bearers. Today, the stone spheres remain silent witnesses to a lost worldview. They don't speak directly about themselves and resist easy interpretation. Their silence gives rise to numerous hypotheses, but each one is hampered by a lack of data. This is precisely what makes the spheres one of the most intriguing archaeological phenomena in America. The significance of stone spheres lies not only in their mystery, but also in how they expand our understanding of the past. They demonstrate that ancient societies were capable of creating objects whose meaning extended beyond everyday practice. These ideal forms reflect a desire for order, harmony, and perhaps even a comprehension of the world as a whole. The stone spheres of Costa Rica continue to raise unanswered questions. They remind us that human history is not only made up of wars and technology, but also of symbols whose meanings can be lost forever. This is why these enigmatic spheres remain one of the most fascinating mysteries of pre-Columbian America. The disappearance of Norte Chico. The Norte Chico civilization, also known as Corral Supa, is considered one of the earliest and least understood complex cultures on the planet. It existed on the Pacific coast of South America, in what is now Peru, several millennia before the advent of ceramics, metals, and advanced forms of writing. The discovery of Norte Chico radically changed our understanding of the development of human societies, and its disappearance has become one of the most intriguing mysteries of the ancient world. The archaeological sites of Norte Chico were discovered relatively late. For a long time, the massive earthen platforms and stone structures were considered natural hills. Only systematic research revealed that scholars were discovering a network of interconnected urban centers, forming a unified cultural zone. The most famous of these was Corral, a large ceremonial center with monumental architecture. Norte Chico cities were distinguished by their sophisticated planning. At their centers were pyramidal platforms surrounded by open plazas and sunken circular courtyards. These spaces were likely used for social and ritual gatherings. The scale of the structures is astonishing, especially considering that the culture developed without the use of metal or draft animals. The economic basis of Norte Chico also raises questions. Unlike other early civilizations, no obvious traces of intensive agriculture based on cereals have been found here. Marine resources apparently played a primary role. Fishing and seafood gathering provided a stable food source, supported by exchange with inland areas where cotton and other crops were grown. This development model makes Norte Chico unique. For the first time in history, a complex society developed not around grain farming, but rather around a maritime economy and exchange. This system required a high degree of organization and trust between different population groups. This is why the existence of large ceremonial centers seems particularly surprising. The social structure of Norte Chico remains unclear. Archaeological remains reveal almost no evidence of armed conflict, fortifications, or mass graves. This has led to the hypothesis that the society was predominantly peaceful. Authority was likely based not on military force, but on religious authority and control over rituals and resource exchange. Music and ritual may have played a special role in Norte Chico culture. Archaeologists have found flutes made from the bones of pelicans and other birds. Such abundance of musical instruments indicates a developed ceremonial tradition. Music may have served as a means of community unification and strengthening social hierarchy. Despite the resilience of this system, around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the cities of Norte Chico began to decline. Construction ceased, ceremonial centers were gradually abandoned, and traces of organized life disappeared. As with Harappa, this was not a sudden catastrophe, but the gradual disintegration of a complex structure. Climate change is considered one possible cause of Norte Chico's disappearance. The Peruvian coast is susceptible to climate fluctuations, including those associated with ocean temperature changes. Even small shifts could have disrupted the marine ecosystem on which the civilization's economy depended. A decline in catches could have undermined the foundations of social stability. Changes in the exchange system could have been an equally important factor. If inland regions stopped supplying cotton or other resources, this could have disrupted the balance between coastal and inland communities. In the absence of a centralized military force, such disruptions could have led to the disintegration of the network of interactions that sustained civilization. Internal social changes are also being considered. The religious system, which provided legitimacy to power, could have lost its significance. If rituals were no longer perceived as a guarantee of well-being, the elite's authority could have been undermined. In such a case, the population would have preferred to abandon ceremonial centers and move toward more local forms of organization. Interestingly, the disappearance of Norte Chico did not coincide with the complete disappearance of the region's population. Archaeological evidence shows that people continued to live on the coast, but in a different form. Large-scale monumental structures were no longer erected, and society became less centralized. This suggests a transformation, not the collapse, of the culture. The mystery of Norte Chico is heightened by the lack of written sources. Everything known about this civilization is reconstructed from architecture, remains of economic activity, and rare artifacts. This makes any interpretation hypothetical and open to revision. Every new discovery has the potential to change the overall picture. The special significance of Norte Chico lies in its place in human history. It demonstrates that the paths to complex social organization can be diverse. Monumental architecture, ritual centers, and hierarchy can arise even without the technological foundations common to other civilizations. This forces us to reconsider universal models of development. The disappearance of Norte Chico highlights the vulnerability of such unconventional systems. A society built on a delicate balance of natural resources, exchange, and symbolic power can be particularly sensitive to environmental changes. When one element is disrupted, the entire structure begins to disintegrate. For modern scholarship, Norte Chico remains a laboratory of ideas. Hypotheses about the origins of government and the role of religion and economics in early societies are being tested here. The disappearance of this civilization serves as a reminder that complexity does not guarantee longevity, and that stability can be deceptive. Today, the ruins of Corral and other centers of Norte Chico stand amidst deserted valleys, like frozen testaments to a lost experiment in human history. Their silence contrasts with the scale of the design once embodied in these stone and earthen forms. It is precisely this disparity between grandeur and fading that makes Norte Chico particularly captivating to researchers. The disappearance of Norte Chico doesn't provide definitive answers, but it does raise important questions. Why do people create complex structures knowing they may not survive environmental change? What role do faith and ritual play in maintaining social stability? And can extinction be considered a defeat if the culture survives in an altered form? In this sense, Norte Chico is not simply a vanished civilization, but a key to understanding the earliest stages of human thought. Its history demonstrates that even the most ancient societies were capable of complex decisions, but remained dependent on a fragile balance between nature, economics, and symbols. This is why the mystery of Norte Chico's disappearance continues to hold a special place among the mysteries of the ancient world. Ritual shafts of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is one of the most enigmatic cities of the ancient world, and its secrets extend beyond its grandiose pyramids and meticulously planned streets. Beneath the surface of this gigantic metropolis lies another, less visible, but no less important level, a system of underground shafts, tunnels, and chambers that played a key role in the city's ritual and symbolic life. It is Teotihuacan's ritual shafts that offer a deeper understanding of the worldview of its founders and the reasons why this city became a center of power and worship for many centuries. Teotihuacan arose and flourished in central Mexico long before the arrival of the Aztecs. At its peak, it was one of the largest cities on the planet, with a population estimated in the tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands. Its streets and squares were laid out according to a strict plan, oriented toward astronomical and cosmological principles. However, this orderliness was not limited to the surface. The underground space was integrated into the overall sacred concept of the city. The ritual shafts of Teotihuacan are most often associated with the extraction of obsidian, a volcanic glass of great economic and religious significance. Obsidian was used to make tools, weapons, and religious objects, and its luster and sharpness were imbued with symbolic meaning. However, many shafts went far beyond utilitarian mining. Their shape, depth, and location indicate that they served as sites for special ceremonies. One of the most famous underground sites is the tunnel beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. It was discovered relatively recently and immediately attracted the attention of researchers. The tunnel extends tens of meters deep and ends in a series of chambers carefully carved into the rock. Ritual objects, sacrificial offerings, and traces of complex ceremonies associated with beliefs about the underworld were discovered inside. For the inhabitants of Teotihuacan, the subterranean space held profound symbolic significance. In Mesoamerican cultures, the underworld was perceived not only as the realm of the dead, but also as the birthplace of life, the source of water, fertility, and renewal. Shafts and tunnels could symbolize the path between worlds, connecting the heavenly, terrestrial, and subterranean dimensions of the cosmos. Many ritual shafts take the form of artificial caves. Caves were considered sacred in Mesoamerican tradition, associated with the womb of the earth. According to myths, it was from caves that the first humans and gods emerged. The creation of artificial underground spaces at Teotihuacan can be seen as an attempt to reproduce this mythological image in architecture. Particular attention was paid to the depth of the shafts. Some of them extend significantly below the city level, creating a sense of isolation from the outside world. Entering such spaces was accompanied by a sharp change in light, temperature, and acoustics. These factors intensified the psychological impact of the rituals and emphasized the transition to a different state of being. A person descending into a shaft literally left the world of the living. Archaeological finds confirm the ritualistic nature of these underground structures. The shafts contain the remains of sacrificial animals, rare minerals, ceramics, and objects with no known everyday purpose. Some chambers were intentionally filled in after ceremonies as if permanently sealing their sacred function. This indicates a strictly regulated use of the underground space. Interestingly, ritual shafts are often associated with key architectural elements of the city. They are located beneath temples, plazas, or along the main axis of Teotihuacan. This arrangement suggests that the underworld was an integral part of the urban structure, not a secondary element. Above-ground and underground architecture formed a unified symbolic system. There are suggestions that underground rituals were linked to the legitimization of power. Teotihuacan's elite may have used the shafts as sites for secret ceremonies inaccessible to ordinary citizens. Participation in such rituals confirmed special status and a connection to divine powers. In this context, underground space became an instrument of social hierarchy. Ritual shafts may also have played a role in calendrical and astronomical practices. Some tunnels are oriented in specific directions, coinciding with important dates in the solar or stellar cycles. This suggests that the descent underground was part of complex ceremonies associated with altering time cycles, renewing the world, and maintaining cosmic order. The question of who exactly built these mines remains unclear. Their construction required considerable effort as well as knowledge of geology and engineering. This indicates a high level of labor organization and the presence of specialists capable of working in difficult conditions. The construction of underground structures was no less important than the construction of the pyramids, although it remained hidden from view. Over time, the ritual shafts lost their significance. The reasons for this process are linked to the general decline of Teotihuacan. As the city began to lose its political and religious influence, the complex system of underground rituals became unnecessary. Some shafts were deliberately filled in, others were simply abandoned. This closure of the underworld symbolized the end of an era. The disappearance of Teotihuacan as a center of power remains a mystery. However, underground shafts provide important clues. They reveal how closely religion, architecture, and social structure were intertwined. When this balance was disrupted, the city lost its sacred significance and was abandoned. For modern researchers, the ritual shafts of Teotihuacan are particularly valuable. They offer insight into a part of the culture that was deliberately concealed. Studying these underground structures requires caution and new methods, as any intervention could destroy the fragile context. Nevertheless, each new discovery expands our understanding of the spiritual world of Teotihuacan. Ritual shafts demonstrate that this city was not simply a place of residence, but a complex cosmological model. The surface symbolized the ordered world of humans and gods, while the underground spaces represented chaos, birth, and transformation. Only the interaction of these levels ensured the harmony in which the city's inhabitants believed. Today, Teotihuacan's underground mines remain partially hidden and poorly studied. They continue to preserve traces of rituals that are impossible to fully reconstruct. Their silence underscores that a significant portion of the spiritual experience of ancient civilizations forever eludes modern understanding. The ritual shafts of Teotihuacan are key to understanding how ancient societies perceived space, power, and the sacred. They demonstrate that the most important processes may have occurred not in plain sight, but in the darkness, underground, far from everyday life. It was there, in the depths of the city, that ideas about the order of the world and humanity's place in it were formed. The riddle of Ollantaytambo. Ollantaytambo is one of the most impressive and yet least clearly explained sites in the Andean region. Located in the sacred valley of the Incas in modern-day Peru, this complex combines features of a fortress, a ritual center, and an unfinished megalithic project. Its massive terraces, monumental walls, and gigantic stone blocks create a space in which engineering logic intertwines with symbolism and clear functions coexist with unanswered questions. Ollantaytambo's geographic location is no coincidence. It is located at the confluence of mountain routes leading from the highlands to the jungle, and where the river forms a natural corridor. Control of this location meant control over the flow of people, resources, and information. However, unlike purely military fortifications, Ollantaytambo exhibits a complex internal structure that extends beyond defensive objectives. The architecture of the complex is striking, first and foremost, for the scale of the stonework. Enormous blocks of solid rock, some weighing tens of tons, fit together perfectly. The surfaces are smooth, the corners are clearly defined, and the joints between the stones are minimal. Moreover, the stone used was quarried on the opposite bank of the river, immediately raising the question of transportation and logistics. Quarries located at a considerable distance and on the other side of a turbulent river retain traces of the work. Some blocks remain lying on the slopes, as if work had been abruptly stopped. This creates a sense of incompleteness about a project that for some reason was never completed. The reasons for this interruption are still debated. The Temple of the Sun, a structure composed of gigantic monoliths erected on a high terrace, has attracted particular attention from researchers. Its location and orientation suggest a connection to solar cycles. On certain days of the year, sunlight strikes the stone surfaces at a specific angle, highlighting their shape and creating a visual effect clearly intended by the architects. The Ollantaytambo terrace system served more than just agricultural purposes. While many terraces were used for growing crops, their scale and precision suggest an additional role. The terraces form a kind of staircase leading to the complex's sacred areas. This upward movement can be interpreted as a ritual path symbolizing the transition from the mundane to the divine. Ollantaytambo's engineering solutions include a complex water supply system. Channels cut into the rock still function, distributing water to terraces and residential areas. The flow of water is controlled with great precision, demonstrating a profound understanding of hydrodynamics. Water here was not simply a resource, but part of the ritual and symbolic space. Historically, Ollantaytambo is associated with the final stage of the Inca resistance to the Spanish conquest. It was here that one of the few significant victories over the conquistadors took place. However, the military function of the complex was likely secondary, developing from existing architecture. The original design of the site may have been quite different. The age of Ollantaytambo remains an open question. Traditionally, it is associated with the heyday of the Inca Empire. However, some elements of the complex appear older and do not fully fit into the known building traditions of the time. Differences in masonry style and stonework suggest several construction phases. It is hypothesized that the Incas used and rebuilt earlier structures. In this case, Ollantaytambo could have been an inherited sacred center whose significance persisted for centuries. The Incas, known for their practice of integrating foreign sacred sites, could only have enhanced and reinterpreted the existing structure. Of particular interest are the so-called stone doors and niches, carved with astonishing precision. Their purpose is unclear. They do not serve as entrances to rooms or as utilitarian objects. Perhaps these elements had symbolic significance or were used in rituals involving shadows, light, and the movement of the sun. Some blocks in Ollantaytambo have complex shapes with protrusions and grooves. These elements are not decorative, but are not always structurally necessary. Their presence may indicate specific building standards or symbolism lost to modern understanding. Ollantaytambo is also viewed as part of a broader sacred geography. It is connected by visual and astronomical lines to other important centers in the region. The mountains surrounding the complex serve as natural landmarks, and the landscape itself is integrated into the architectural design. This suggests that the space was perceived holistically without dividing it into natural and artificial. The mystery of Ollantaytambo is heightened by the fact that there are no written sources about its construction. All that is known is based on archaeological data and later chronicles, often contradictory. This creates ample room for interpretation, but simultaneously limits the ability to test hypotheses. It's also unclear what role this site played in everyday life. Was Ollantaytambo a permanently inhabited city, or was it used primarily for ceremonies and special events? Archaeological finds indicate the presence of residential areas, but their scale doesn't match the monumentality of the sacred structures. The fact that some elements of the complex remain unfinished lends it particular significance. It seems to mark the moment of interruption, when the grand project was interrupted. This may be due to political changes, an external threat, or internal social transformations. However, the exact cause remains unknown. Modern research at Ollantaytambo faces challenges. The site is heavily visited, limiting the potential for large-scale excavations. Furthermore, many elements have already been restored, making it difficult to distinguish original structures from later interventions. However, new analytical methods are gradually revealing additional details. Ollantaytambo challenges simplistic notions of Inca technology. It demonstrates that their engineering and architectural capabilities were significantly greater than previously thought. However, the lack of clear explanations highlights the possibility that some of this knowledge may have been lost along with the culture's bearers. The mystery of this place lies not in any one specific element, but in a combination of factors. The scale, precision, incompleteness, and sacred context create the image of a complex that cannot be reduced to a single function or era. It remains multi-layered and open to new interpretations. Today, Ollantaytambo is perceived as the key to understanding Andean civilization. It demonstrates how architecture can be an expression of a worldview where stone, water, light, and landscape form a unified system. It is precisely in this integrity that its greatest secret lies. Ollantaytambo remains silent about its true purpose. Its walls and terraces bear traces of human design, the scale of which remains unexplored. This site serves as a reminder that even in well-studied ancient regions, sites remain capable of challenging established paradigms and opening new horizons for exploring the past. Dungeons of Axum. Axum is an ancient city in northern Ethiopia, long perceived primarily as an above-ground monument, steles, temples, palaces, and stone platforms. However, beneath this monumental surface lies a less visible but no less significant layer, a system of underground chambers, corridors, and caverns, the existence of which has only been partially documented by archaeology. It is the underground structures of Axum that give this site its unique depth and transform it from a simple ancient city into a complex sacred and political center. The Axumite civilization arose at the crossroads of trade routes between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. It quickly grew into a powerful state, controlling the trade in gold, ivory, and incense. Such a concentration of wealth and power inevitably required special spaces, not only for displaying power, but also for concealing it. Underground structures were ideal for this purpose. Archaeological evidence indicates the presence of underground chambers carved into the rock beneath the palaces and temples of Axum. Some were discovered by chance, others through targeted exploration. These spaces are distinguished by their strict geometry, smooth walls, and a well-thought-out system of entrances. Rather than appearing as improvised cellars or storage pits, they give the impression of being pre-designed spaces. Some of the underground chambers apparently served a funerary purpose. Complex tombs of nobles have been discovered in Axum, often multi-level, with stone staircases and ceilings. These tombs are concealed beneath massive platforms, creating a vertical structure within the sacred space. The above-ground world of the living and the underground world of the dead are connected into a single architectural system. This design emphasizes the importance of ancestor worship and notions of afterlife power. However, the Axum dungeons serve more than just burial purposes. Some chambers contain no evidence of burials and appear too spacious and elaborate to be simple tombs. This has led to theories that the underground chambers may have housed storage areas, archives, or sacred spaces accessible only to a limited number of people. Of particular interest is the connection between underground spaces and religious tradition. Axum was one of the first states to adopt Christianity at the level of the ruling elite. However, prior to this, there were more ancient beliefs associated with local deities and the royal cult. The underground spaces may have served as venues for rituals that were not intended for public display and required isolation. In Ethiopian tradition, the subterranean space is often associated with secret knowledge and sanctity. Even in later eras, monasteries and temples included hidden chambers and passages. This suggests that the Axumite practice of creating underground spaces influenced subsequent religious architecture in the region. The underworld was perceived as a place of special divine presence. The engineering aspects of Axumite underground structures also deserve attention. They were carved into solid rock and required precise calculations to prevent collapse. In some cases, stone ceilings and supports were used, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of load-bearing capacity and stability. This suggests the presence of specialists capable of working with underground spaces at a high level. Dungeons are often located beneath the most important above-ground structures. This connection is no accident. It creates a vertical axis of power and sacredness, where the ruler or temple literally rises above the hidden foundation. The subterranean becomes not only a physical foundation, but also a symbolic one. There is also a theory that underground chambers were used to store valuable objects and relics. In the context of political instability and external threats, these hidden spaces provided reliable protection. However, archaeological finds in this regard are extremely limited, which may be due either to looting or to the fact that the contents of such storage areas were intentionally removed. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant occupies a special place in discussions of the Aksumite dungeons. According to local tradition, the sacred relic is kept in Aksum and is inaccessible to outsiders. Although archaeology does not confirm this legend, the very idea of the secret storage of a sacred object fuels interest in the city's underground structures. They become part of a broader system of myths and beliefs that shape the image of Aksum as a hidden center of sacred power. It's important to note that the Aksum underground remains only partially explored. Current research faces a number of limitations, including dense urban development, religious sensitivities, and access difficulties. Many sites have either not been explored at all or have only been superficially documented. This leaves considerable room for future discoveries. Aksum's historical fate is one of gradual decline. Shifting trade routes, climatic factors, and political transformations led to the loss of its significance. However, underground structures, hidden from time and destruction, may have been better preserved than above-ground structures. This creates a paradox. The most important evidence of the past may be found precisely where we have looked least. The Aksumite dungeons offer a new perspective on the nature of this civilization. They reveal that power was expressed not only through visible symbols, but also through hidden spaces. Secrecy, access control, and isolation played no less a role than displays of power. In this regard, Aksum emerges as a state with a profound understanding of the symbolism of space. The mystery of the dungeons lies in their silence. They contain no inscriptions that could directly explain their purpose. Their meaning must be reconstructed from indirect evidence, architecture, and context. This makes any conclusions preliminary and open to revision. Modern technologies, such as geophysical scanning, offer hope for identifying new underground structures without destroying the cultural layer. Perhaps in the future, a more extensive network of corridors and chambers will be discovered, changing our understanding of the scale of subterranean Aksum. For now, we see only fragments of a much more complex picture. The Aksum underground reminds us that ancient cities were not only horizontal, but also vertical. Their life unfolded on several levels, each with its own significance. Public history took place above ground, while its foundations, ritual, political, and symbolic, were hidden beneath. Ultimately, the Aksumite dungeons remain one of the most underappreciated aspects of this civilization. They reveal the depth of thought and the complexity of a society that knew how to work not only with stone and space, but also with mystery. It is precisely this hidden depth that makes Aksum not just an ancient city, but a key node in understanding African sacred architecture. The Lost Archives of Nineveh. Nineveh was not just the capital of the Assyrian Empire, but one of the greatest intellectual centers of the ancient world. Situated on the east bank of the Tigris, this city became a place where knowledge was perceived as an instrument of power, memory, and control over reality. The Nineveh archives were not a random collection of texts, but a carefully organized information storage system encompassing religion, science, government, and history. This is why their disappearance remains one of the most profound and disturbing mysteries of antiquity. The library of King Ashurbanipal, discovered in the 19th century, is the most famous. The cuneiform tablets discovered revolutionized the study of the ancient East. They contained myths, epics, ritual texts, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, and administrative documents. However, it quickly became clear that the finds were only part of a much more extensive archival system that existed in Nineveh. The Assyrian state placed exceptional importance on writing. Scribes trained for years, and the ability to read and write cuneiform was considered a mark of the elite. Archives served not only as a repository, but also as a means of legitimizing power. Laws, divine decrees, and historical narratives beneficial to the ruling dynasty were codified through texts. The loss of such archives meant the loss of the very mechanism for reproducing state memory. The Nineveh archives were distributed among various buildings. The tablets were stored in palaces, temples, and special rooms, sometimes located underground. They were sorted by subject, annotated, and cataloged. This demonstrates a high level of archival thinking, comparable to much later eras. The Assyrians recognized the value of systematizing information and sought to preserve it for future generations. However, the fate of these archives proved tragic. At the end of the 7th century BCE, Nineveh was devastated by a military cataclysm. The city fell, the palaces burned, and the temples were plundered. Paradoxically, it was fire that preserved some of the tablets, baking the wet clay and hardening it. But at the same time, it destroyed vast tracts of organic material which have not survived to this day. Researchers increasingly suggest that a significant portion of Nineveh's archives existed in more than just clay tablets. Wax-coated wooden tablets, papyrus, and parchment were also used. These materials were convenient for everyday use, but extremely vulnerable to fire and time. They likely constituted the bulk of the current documentation and were irretrievably lost. The loss of scientific and philosophical texts is particularly painful. Discovered cuneiform sources show that the Assyrians possessed profound knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. They systematically observed celestial bodies, recorded eclipses, and developed complex interpretative frameworks. It can be assumed that more comprehensive treatises also existed that have not survived. The Nineveh archives also included texts borrowed from older cultures. The Assyrians deliberately collected Mesopotamian knowledge, copying Sumerian and Babylonian works. Thus, Nineveh became a repository of the region's collective memory. The destruction of the archives meant the loss of not only Assyrian but also older intellectual heritage. It has been suggested that some of the archives may have been removed or hidden before the city's fall. The Assyrian elite recognized the threat and may have attempted to save the most valuable texts. However, archaeological evidence of this has not yet been found. If such caches existed, they remain undiscovered or were destroyed in subsequent eras. The mystery of the lost archives is compounded by the fact that we don't know their full contents. We infer lost knowledge from fragments, chance tablets, and indirect references. This creates a distorted picture in which individual texts acquire inordinate significance simply because they survived. The actual intellectual life of Nineveh may have been far richer and more complex. Archives played a special role in religious practice. Assyrian priests relied on extensive textual corpora to interpret omens, dreams, and astrological phenomena. Decisions of state importance were often based on such interpretations. The loss of archives meant a break with tradition and the loss of accumulated experience in interacting with the sacred world. The disappearance of the Nineveh archives became a symbol of the vulnerability of knowledge to historical catastrophes. A great power that controlled vast territories proved unable to protect its own memory. This reminds us that technological and military superiority do not guarantee the preservation of cultural heritage. Modern archaeological research continues to uncover new tablets, but they represent only a small fraction of what was lost. Each discovery simultaneously brings joy and heightens the sense of loss, as it reveals how fragmented our knowledge of the past is. It's as if we're reading a book from which entire chapters have been torn out. The lost archives of Nineveh are also important as a warning. They demonstrate that knowledge requires not only creation, but also protection, copying, and transmission. The Assyrians recognized this and attempted to systematize information, but even their efforts proved insufficient in the face of destruction. Today, Nineveh is perceived as a symbol of a lost intellectual world. Its vanished archives continue to influence modern scholarship precisely through their absence. They form a field of unanswerable questions and serve as a reminder of how much human experience can be lost forever. The mystery of the Nineveh archives lies not only in what was lost, but also in understanding the scale of this loss. We are dealing not with the disappearance of individual texts, but with the disappearance of an entire system of knowledge. This is why Nineveh remains one of the most tragic and simultaneously most significant symbols of the lost memory of the ancient world. The undeciphered Rongorongo letter. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island remains one of the most enduring mysteries of world scholarship. It is the only known system of writing that arose in an isolated region of Oceania and has no reliably established connection to other writing traditions. Wooden tablets inscribed with symbols appear as a silent archive of a vanished world, where meaning eludes and context is almost completely lost. It is precisely this combination of isolation, the loss of cultural bearers, and the fragmentary nature of its sources that makes Rongorongo a unique case in the history of human knowledge. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is itself a place of paradoxes. This small island, thousands of kilometers removed from the mainland, gave rise to a complex culture with monumental statues, a developed social structure, and, apparently, its own tradition of recording information. The emergence of writing in such a context was long considered impossible, which only fueled skepticism about the authenticity of Rongorongo as a true writing system. The first mention of Rongorongo dates back to the 19th century, when European missionaries noticed wooden tablets kept by local residents. They were carved with rows of strange symbols, human figures, birds, fish, geometric elements, and abstract symbols. Even then, it became clear that these were not simple decorations, but a repeating system governed by specific rules. A distinctive feature of Rongorongo is its writing method. The text was written in continuous lines, read in a so-called boustrophedon. After finishing a line, the tablet was flipped over, and the next line was read in the opposite direction. The signs themselves were also inverted, requiring special skill on the part of the reader. This complexity indicates a long tradition of learning and a stable system of knowledge transmission. The material of the tablets plays a key role in the fate of Rongorongo. The tablets were made from wood from local trees or debris washed up by the sea. Wood is an extremely fragile material, especially in humid oceanic climates. This means that even under favorable conditions, only a few of the texts that once existed could have survived to this day. The situation worsened during the period of colonial contact. Europeans disregarded local texts, and missionaries often destroyed tablets, believing them to be carriers of pagan beliefs. As a result, only a few dozen fragments survive, many of them damaged, broken, or lacking context. We are dealing not with a textual corpus, but with fragments. The main difficulty in deciphering Rongorongo is the lack of bilingual texts. Throughout the history of writing, the key to deciphering it has almost always been a translation into a known language, or at least an inscription with names and dates. In the case of Rongorongo, there is no such key. Moreover, the language of the ancient Easter Islanders has changed under the influence of external factors, making the comparison even more difficult. There are differing views on the nature of Rongorongo. Some researchers consider it a fully fledged written language, capable of conveying speech. Others believe it is a mnemonic system designed for memorizing chants, genealogies, or rituals. In this case, the signs did not directly record speech, but served as cues for trained bearers of the tradition. Jomdi, arguments in favor of writing are based on the complexity of the system and the repetitiveness of its structures. Some sequences of signs appear on different tablets, which may indicate formulas or set expressions. There are also signs of syntactic organization, although without an understanding of the language, these remain hypothetical. Opponents of this viewpoint point to the limited volume of the texts and the absence of obvious phonetic elements. Of particular interest is the possible connection between Rongorongo and the social elite of Easter Island. It is believed that reading and writing were the privileges of a small circle of priests or chieftains. If so, the loss of this elite as a result of epidemics and the forced deportation of the population in the 19th century could have led to the complete disappearance of reading skills. Writing ceased to be a living practice and became an incomprehensible set of signs. The context of Rongorongo's disappearance is inextricably linked to the tragic history of Easter Island. Colonial contact brought disease, the slave trade, and the destruction of traditional structures. Within a few decades, the population declined catastrophically. Under these conditions, the transmission of complex knowledge became impossible. Even if someone still remembered the meaning of the symbols, this memory was not recorded. Comparative analysis of Rongorongo with other writing systems has yielded inconclusive results. Some researchers have attempted to find parallels with the scripts of the Americas or Southeast Asia, suggesting an external influence. However, there is no evidence of such contact. On the contrary, the uniqueness of the signs and their composition rather points to an independent origin. Modern analysis methods offer new but limited possibilities. Computational linguistics allows us to study character frequencies, identify recurring structures, and test hypotheses about grammar. These studies demonstrate that the system is not chaotic. However, without knowledge of the language and cultural context, such results remain statistical rather than meaningful. Rongorongo is important not only as a mystery of writing, but also as evidence of an alternative path of cultural development. It demonstrates that the desire to record knowledge arises in a wide variety of settings and does not necessarily require external influence. Even an isolated society can create a complex system of symbols if there is a social and ritual need for it. The disappearance of Rongorongo is particularly revealing in the context of the vulnerability of intangible heritage. The stone statues of Easter Island survive despite destruction, but writing, which requires a living tradition, has almost completely disappeared. This underscores that knowledge does not exist in isolation. It requires bearers, teaching, and continuity. Some researchers suggest that Rongorongo may have been used to record calendar cycles related to agriculture and rituals. In this case, the texts would have been closely tied to specific events of the year and were not intended for free reading. Losing the calendar context would have rendered such records meaningless to posterity. There is also a hypothesis that Rongorongo recorded the genealogies of ruling families. In a society where status and power were transmitted through descent, such a record would have been crucial. The loss of these texts could have contributed to the disintegration of the social structure and exacerbated the cultural crisis. The undeciphered Rongorongo script remains a rare example of the near-total disappearance of a written tradition. We know it existed, we see traces of it, but we cannot reconstruct its content. This creates a unique tension between material presence and semantic emptiness. The signs are there, but they are silent. For science, Rongorongo is a reminder of the limits of reconstructing the past. Not all mysteries can be solved, especially if the chain of knowledge transmission is broken. Unlike archaeological objects, writing requires not only form, but also understanding, and understanding disappears along with the bearers of a culture. Today, Rongorongo remains the subject of cautious research, free from sensational conclusions. Most experts acknowledge that the likelihood of a complete decipherment is extremely low. Nevertheless, each new attempt at analysis allows for a better understanding of the system's structure and the cultural environment in which it emerged. The undeciphered Rongorongo script is more than just a riddle of symbols. It's a story about how knowledge can vanish almost without a trace, leaving only a shell. It provokes reflection on the fragility of cultural memory and how many intellectual worlds have been lost beyond repair. This is why Rongorongo holds a special place among the deepest mysteries of human history. Liangzhu? The Liangzhu culture occupies a special place in the history of ancient China and East Asia as a whole. It flourished in the lower reaches of the Yangtze River and became one of the earliest highly organized civilizations in the region. For a long time, almost nothing was known about it, but its discoveries in the 20th century radically changed our understanding of the origins of complex societies in China. However, no less astonishing than the level of Liangzhu's development is its sudden and still not fully explained disappearance. The Liangzhu Cultural Center was not just a settlement, but a large-scale proto-city with a clearly defined plan. Archaeological excavations have revealed massive earthen walls, canals, dams, and a complex water management system. These structures demonstrate that the inhabitants of Liangzhu possessed outstanding engineering skills and understood the principles of hydraulics long before the emergence of classical Chinese states. Water management was not an auxiliary task, but the foundation of the entire social system. Liangzhu is particularly renowned for its jade culture. Jade artifacts are striking not only for their quantity, but also for the level of craftsmanship. Discs, tubes, and ritual objects crafted from this hard stone have precise forms and symbolism that persisted for centuries. Jade was not used in everyday life, but rather had a purely sacred and status-related significance. This indicates the presence of a developed ideology and social hierarchy. Liangzhu society was clearly stratified. Rich burials containing jade objects contrast sharply with more modest burials. This suggests the existence of an elite that controlled resources, rituals, and likely engineering projects. However, traces of mass violence or constant warfare have been found. Power was apparently based not on military force, but on control of knowledge and sacred practices. One of Liangzhu's most impressive achievements was a system of dams and canals stretching for tens of kilometers. These structures allowed for the regulation of water levels, protecting settlements from flooding, and ensuring sustainable agriculture. The scale of the work demonstrates a high degree of collective organization and the ability to mobilize large numbers of people for long-term projects. This makes Liangzhu one of the earliest hydraulic civilizations in the world. For a long time, it was believed that this level of engineering emerged in China much later. However, discoveries in the Liangzhu region revealed that complex forms of environmental management existed even in ancient times. This forced a reconsideration of linear models of civilizational development and the recognition that different regions could achieve high levels of organization independently. Despite the system's resilience, the Liangzhu culture disappeared around the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Urban centers were abandoned. Ritual complexes fell into disuse, and the complex hydraulic system deteriorated. The archaeological record does not indicate a sudden military collapse. Instead, its disappearance appears to have been a relatively rapid but not catastrophic process. One of the leading hypotheses is a sharp climate change. Geological studies show that during this period, the region experienced a series of severe floods associated with a shift in monsoon patterns. For a society completely dependent on precise water control, such extreme events could have been fatal. Even a minor dam failure could have led to a chain reaction, destroying the foundation of the economy. Floods could not only destroy infrastructure, but also undermine the sacred authority of the elite. If the ruling class was associated with control over natural forces and rituals, failure to prevent a disaster could be perceived as a loss of divine mandate. In such a case, the social system could disintegrate from within without external intervention. There are also alternative theories. Some researchers suggest that the Liangzhu population did not disappear, but migrated to other regions, becoming part of new cultures. In this case, Liangzhu should be viewed not as a lost civilization, but as a transformed tradition, elements of which were inherited by subsequent societies. However, direct continuity is weak. The disappearance of the jade tradition poses a particular mystery. After the decline of Liangzhu, the mass production of jade ritual objects ceased. Such items reappear only much later and in a different context. This suggests a rupture in cultural memory and the loss of a symbolic system that was key to Liangzhu's identity. The lack of written sources makes reconstructing the history of the Liangzhu culture particularly difficult. Everything known about this culture is based on archaeological data and interpretations. We see infrastructure, objects, and traces of activity, but we don't know how the inhabitants themselves explained what happened or how they perceived their world. This creates room for hypothesis, but limits the possibility of definitive conclusions. Liangzhu is important not only as an archaeological site, but also as a conceptual challenge. It demonstrates that early civilizations may have been built around ecological balance and ritual control, rather than military expansion. In this sense, its disappearance exemplifies the vulnerability of complex systems dependent on a stable natural environment. Modern research at Liangzhu continues, yielding new discoveries. Using remote sensing and geoarchaeology, we can uncover hidden elements of the hydraulic network. This data gradually reveals the scale of the civilization and its technical capabilities. However, the more we learn, the clearer the scale of the loss becomes. The disappearance of the Liangzhu Empire was not accompanied by the creation of myths or written legends that have come down to us. Unlike many other civilizations, it left no direct trace in the cultural memory of subsequent eras. This makes its disappearance particularly complete and disturbing. An entire world, possessed of complex ideology and engineering, seemed to vanish without a trace. Liangzhu reminds us that civilization is not only the accumulation of knowledge and technology, but also a delicate balance between nature, social structure, and faith. When this balance is disrupted, even the most impressive achievements can disappear in a relatively short time. In this sense, Liangzhu's story serves as a warning, relevant even for today. Today, the ruins of Liangzhu are perceived as evidence of an alternative path for the development of human societies. They demonstrate that complexity can emerge early and vanish just as early, leaving no direct heirs. It is precisely this combination of early flourishing and complete disappearance that makes Liangzhu one of the most profound and underappreciated mysteries of the ancient world. The disappearance of the Anasazi. The Anasazi culture, now more commonly known as the Ancestral Pueblo, was one of the most complex and enigmatic civilizations of pre-Columbian North America. For centuries, its people inhabited vast swaths of the southwestern United States, constructing stone settlements, building roads, creating water storage systems, and developing a resilient social structure in a harsh and unstable climate. However, around the end of the 13th century, their largest centers were abandoned, and their culture itself was transformed beyond recognition. The Anasazi were not a unified state in the traditional sense. They were a network of communities bound together by shared traditions, architecture, and worldview. Their settlements ranged from small villages to massive complexes containing hundreds of rooms. Particularly impressive are the so-called cliff cities, carved or built into the sheer walls of canyons. These structures required not only engineering skills, but also a profound understanding of the landscape. Anasazi architecture was distinguished by its thoughtfulness and functionality. Stone houses were constructed with sunlight, wind, and seasonal temperature fluctuations in mind. Large centers featured kivas, round or square underground spaces used for rituals and gatherings. Kivas played a key role in social life and reflected beliefs about human origins and their connection to the underworld. The Anasazi economy was based on agriculture in a resource-limited environment. Growing corn, beans, and squash required precise rainfall management and efficient water management. Terraces, canals, and reservoirs were built for this purpose. This system could only function with relative climatic stability. Any prolonged fluctuations threatened the very existence of the communities. The peak of Anasazi culture occurred during a period of relatively favorable climatic conditions. During this time, major centers emerged, such as Chaco Canyon, with its monumental great houses, straight roads, and complex layout. Chaco appears not as a typical settlement, but as a regional center, fulfilling administrative, ritual, and possibly astronomical functions. Chaco Canyon is striking in its scale of organization. Roads stretched for tens of kilometers, often in straight lines, regardless of the terrain. Their purpose is still debated. They may have served as communication routes, processional routes, or symbolic connections between centers. In any case, their construction required coordination and a shared vision that went beyond mere practical needs. However, it was precisely during this period of prosperity that signs of stress began to emerge. Archaeological evidence indicates population growth, increased dependence on agriculture, and soil depletion. At the same time, periods of prolonged droughts, which could last for decades in the region, are recorded. For a society balancing on the edge of climate tolerance, such changes were extremely dangerous. Climate is considered a key factor in the Anasazi's disappearance. Dendrochronology data shows that the region experienced a series of severe droughts in the late 13th century. Harvests declined, water sources dried up, and traditional coping methods ceased to work. With resources scarce, competition between communities increased. Along with environmental problems, social tensions increased. In later layers, archaeologists find signs of violence, fortified settlements, traces of destruction, and sometimes evidence of intercommunal conflict. This suggests that the previous system of cooperation had broken down. Resources were becoming scarce, but the population remained numerous. The role of religion and ritual in this crisis also raises questions. Kivas and ceremonial centers, which had previously served as unifying elements, could lose their authority. If rituals no longer ensured rain and prosperity, faith in the existing world order could be undermined. This led to a reconsideration of traditions and a search for new paths. The disappearance of the Anasazi was not sudden. Rather than vanishing overnight, the people gradually abandoned major centers, migrating to other areas. These movements were large-scale and likely carefully planned. Modern Pueblo peoples view this period as a time of transition and renewal, not as a cultural collapse. It's important to note that the Anasazi descendants preserved oral traditions that mention long journeys and the search for a new place to live. These stories emphasize the moral and spiritual reasons for leaving, not just the environmental ones. From their perspective, leaving was a necessary step to restore harmony between people in the world. Thus, the disappearance of the Anasazi should be viewed as a complex process of transformation. Archaeologically, this appears as deserted cities and abandoned roads, but culturally it represents a transition to new ways of life. Many elements of tradition, architecture, and worldview were preserved and developed in other regions. The enigma of the Anasazi lies in the combination of a high level of organization and its abandonment. A society capable of constructing complex systems and managing resources, consciously or involuntarily abandoned its previous way of life. This contradicts the widespread notion of an inevitable drive toward complexity and growth. The Anasazi story reminds us that the resilience of a civilization isn't measured solely by the scale of its structures. It depends on flexibility, adaptability, and a willingness to change. When conditions change too quickly or too profoundly, even the most impressive structures can be abandoned without regret. Today, the ruins of Chaco, Mesa Verde, and other Anasazi centers are striking precisely because of their emptiness. They appear complete and simultaneously interrupted, as if the people have departed, leaving the space to speak for itself. This silence has become part of the mystery that continues to fascinate researchers. The disappearance of the Anasazi is not a story of destruction, but a story of choice in times of crisis. It demonstrates that sometimes a culture's survival requires abandoning its accumulated wealth and embarking on a new path. It is in this sense that the Anasazi remain one of the most profound and instructive mysteries of the ancient world. Stone walls of Sacsayhuaman. Sacsayhuaman is one of the most striking and at the same time most difficult to explain architectural complexes in the Andean world. Situated above the ancient Inca capital of Cusco, it dominates the landscape not only physically but also symbolically. The stone walls of Sacsayhuaman are perceived not as conventional defensive structures, but as an expression of a different construction logic in which scale, precision, and form are subordinated to a worldview, not merely to practical needs. The complex is traditionally called a fortress, but this definition doesn't capture its full essence. While Sacsayhuaman did play a military role, particularly during the Spanish conquest, the architecture of the walls far exceeds the needs of a purely defensive structure. Their shape, the size of the blocks, and the method of construction point to a deeper purpose, connected to sacred geography and the Inca understanding of the world order. The most famous part of Sacsayhuaman are its 3 zigzag walls, constructed from gigantic stone blocks. Some of them reach several meters in height and weigh tens, perhaps hundreds of tons. The stones have complex polygonal shapes and are so precisely fitted together that even a thin knife cannot be inserted between them. No mortar was used in the masonry. The origin of these stone blocks remains a major mystery. The quarries were located a considerable distance from the complex, and the route ran through hills and valleys. Moving such masses without wheels, metal, and draft animals seems almost impossible. However, archaeological evidence confirms that the Incas did indeed transport the stone, using teamwork, ropes, and likely complex systems of levers and ramps. However, transportation is only part of the problem. No less remarkable is the stone's processing. The blocks have not only smooth surfaces, but also complex curves, precisely matching the shapes of adjacent stones. This requires multiple fittings, highly precise measurements, and a developed spatial understanding. Furthermore, tool marks are virtually absent, making reconstructing the technique particularly challenging. The zigzag shape of the walls has both practical and symbolic significance. From a military perspective, it allowed for additional vantage points and made assault more difficult. But in the context of Inca cosmology, the zigzag was associated with lightning, water, and the snake, important elements of the sacred world. Thus, the walls could serve both a protective and ritual function. Sacsayhuaman was part of a broader conception of Cusco as a sacred center. The city was perceived as a living organism, and its layout reflected the mythological concept of the body of a sacred animal. In this context, Sacsayhuaman is often interpreted as the head of this symbolic body. The stone walls became not simply fortifications, but elements of a cosmic scheme. Archaeological research shows that Sacsayhuaman was built and rebuilt over a long period. Some elements appear older and more massive than others. This has led to the hypothesis of a multi-stage construction during which the Incas may have used or adapted earlier structures. However, direct evidence of a previous civilization has not yet been found. Spanish chroniclers were astonished by Sacsayhuaman. They described the walls as incredible and acknowledged that such construction had never been seen anywhere in Europe. Many believed that constructing such structures exceeded the capabilities of the Incas. These assessments, however, often reflected not objective reality, but rather the Europeans' inability to understand a different technological tradition. After the conquest, a significant portion of the complex was dismantled. The stones were used to build colonial Cusco. However, the largest blocks of Sacsayhuaman proved too heavy to lift and remained in place. Paradoxically, it was their gigantic size that saved the complex from complete destruction, preserving the main source of questions for future generations. The functional purpose of Sacsayhuaman is still debated. In addition to its defensive role, important state and religious ceremonies may have been held here. The complex's space allows for large crowds to be accommodated, and the layout of the walls creates a natural amphitheater effect. This suggests the possibility of mass rituals associated with state worship. The engineering logic of the walls also deserves attention. The polygonal masonry makes the structures earthquake-resistant. The stones seem to float relative to one another, redistributing the load. This explains why the walls of Sacsayhuaman have survived numerous seismic events, while nearby colonial buildings have repeatedly collapsed. The symbolism of stone played a special role in Inca culture. Stone was perceived as a living material, possessing power and memory. Working with it had a ritualistic quality. In this context, the construction of the walls of Sacsayhuaman can be seen as an act of sacred construction, where not only the result, but also the process itself was important. The mystery of Sacsayhuaman lies not only in how it was built, but also in why it was built that way. The use of enormous blocks wasn't the only possible solution. The Incas deliberately chose the path of maximum complexity and durability. This speaks to a desire to create something beyond current needs. Some researchers suggest that the walls symbolize the eternity and inviolability of the state. They were intended to outlive generations and serve as a reminder of the empire's strength. In this sense, Sacsayhuaman was a stone manifesto of power, addressed not only to contemporaries but also to the future. Today, Sacsayhuaman remains a key site for understanding Inca civilization. It demonstrates a level of organization, engineering, and symbolic imagination that is difficult to fit into simplified developmental models. Its walls are silent, but it is precisely this silence that gives rise to endless questions. The stone walls of Sacsayhuaman represent the boundary between knowledge and incomprehension. We can describe their shape, measure their dimensions, and offer hypotheses, but we cannot fully reconstruct the intentions of their creators. And perhaps this is precisely their strength. They continue to exist as a challenge, a reminder that the past need not be fully explained. The Lost City of Ubar. The Lost City of Ubar occupies a special place among the legends and archaeological mysteries of the Middle East. It is called the Atlantis of the Sands, a city swallowed by the desert, a symbol of lost wealth and human hubris. For centuries, Ubar existed on the border between myth and reality, mentioned in ancient legends, religious texts, and travelers' tales, but lacking a clear archaeological location. It is precisely this duality that has made it one of the most fascinating subjects for researchers. The first mentions of Ubar appear in ancient Arabic tradition. It is described as a wealthy city, located at the crossroads of caravan routes and controlling the incense trade. In these stories, Ubar is portrayed as a center of luxury, power, and arrogance, for which, according to legend, it was punished and disappeared from the face of the earth. These stories were long perceived solely as moralizing myths, lacking any historical basis. However, interest in Ubar continued. Ancient and medieval authors mention thriving cities in southern Arabia associated with the frankincense and myrrh trade. These goods were of great importance in the ancient world, and their routes ran through harsh desert regions. Control over such routes could make any city extremely wealthy. Therefore, the idea of a major center deep in the desert seemed entirely plausible. For a long time, the main problem remained the lack of material evidence. The Rub al-Khali Desert, one of the world's largest sand deserts, is extremely difficult for archaeological research. The sands constantly shift, concealing and destroying traces of human activity. Many researchers believe that if Ubar had existed, its remains may have been completely destroyed or buried at an inaccessible depth. The situation changed in the late 20th century when new technologies were introduced into the study of ancient trade routes. Analysis of satellite images revealed faint lines in the desert, interpreted as traces of caravan routes. These routes converged in an area where no large settlements had previously been recorded. This location became a candidate for the legendary Ubar. Archaeological excavations in the Shaisir region of modern-day Oman have uncovered the remains of a fortified settlement and evidence of intense activity. Walls, towers, and signs of long-term human habitation were discovered. This discovery caused a stir, and many rushed to label the site as Ubar. However, it soon became clear that the situation was far more complex. The discovered settlement turned out to be not a gigantic city, but rather an important trade hub, or caravanserai. It was indeed located at a crossroads and played a significant role in regional trade. But its size did not correspond to the image of the legendary metropolis. This forced researchers to reconsider the very concept of Ubar. Gradually, a hypothesis emerged that Ubar was not a single city in the traditional sense. Rather, the name likely concealed a network of settlements, wells, and trading posts united by a common function and reputation. For travelers and traders, Ubar was not a point on a map, but an entire region associated with wealth and danger. A key element of this system was water sources. In the desert, control of wells meant control of life. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements in the region were built around underground water reservoirs and karst cavities. These structures were vulnerable and could collapse suddenly, causing catastrophic consequences. One of the most convincing theories about Ubar's demise links its disappearance to the collapse of underground cavities. If a city or trading center was located above a karst system, intensive water use could have led to sinkholes. Such events don't necessarily leave spectacular ruins. On the contrary, they could have led to the gradual destruction and abandonment of the area. Climate change also played a significant role. Research shows that in ancient times, the Arabian Peninsula's climate was wetter. Over time, conditions became increasingly arid. Caravan routes shifted, water sources dried up, and cities dependent on trade lost their importance. In such a situation, even a prosperous center could be left without war and disaster. The social factor was no less important. Trading cities existed thanks to the stability and security of their routes. Any changes in the political situation, the emergence of competing routes, or increased instability could undermine the economy. If caravans stopped passing through a region, the city lost its raison d'être. The legendary image of Ubar as a punished city could have arisen precisely against the backdrop of such decline. For posterity, the disappearance of a prosperous center seemed inexplicable and demanded a mythological explanation. Thus arose tales of hubris, divine wrath, and instantaneous destruction, which over time supplanted the real causes. It's important to note that desert archaeology faces serious limitations. Even modern methods cannot fully reconstruct the past. Many sites remain inaccessible, and sand continues to obscure potential traces of settlements. This means that the history of Ubar may never be fully reconstructed. The lost city of Ubar is interesting not only as a specific mystery, but also as an example of how historical memory is formed. It demonstrates how real events become legends, and economic and environmental processes become moral parables. In this sense, Ubar is a bridge between archaeology and mythology. Modern research continues, but it increasingly moves away from the search for a single city. The focus shifts to trade networks, human adaptation to the desert environment, and the reasons for the vulnerability of such systems. Ubar becomes a symbol of an entire era of caravan civilization that disappeared along with the changing world. Ubar's disappearance reminds us that prosperity in extreme conditions is always temporary. It requires a delicate balance between nature, economics, and social organization. Disruption of this balance may lead not to a resounding catastrophe, but to a quiet disappearance that will seem mystical to posterity. Today, the name Ubarra continues to attract attention precisely because it embodies the idea of loss. We know that centers of life and trade existed in the desert, but we cannot pinpoint them with complete certainty. Sand has erased boundaries, and time has transformed history into legend. The lost city of Ubar remains one of the most striking symbols of how human achievements can be absorbed by nature and forgotten. Its mystery lies not so much in searching for ruins as in understanding the processes that make civilizations fragile. And that's why Ubar lives on, not on a map, but in the imagination and the questions we ask of the past. Underground Galleries of Saqqara. The underground galleries of Saqqara form one of the most complex and least understood layers of ancient Egyptian architecture. Pyramids, mastabas, and temples rise above the plateau, but it is underground that conceals the space where Egypt's sacred logic is most fully revealed. These galleries were not random tunnels or auxiliary passages. They represented a carefully planned system, linked to ideas about death, rebirth, and the hidden order of the world. Saqqara served as a necropolis for thousands of years. Kings, priests, dignitaries, and sacred animals were buried there. This long-term use led to the formation of a multi-level underground environment. Galleries from different eras intersected, expanded, sometimes filled in, and then reopened. As a result, a complex labyrinth emerged beneath the plateau, the structure of which has yet to be fully reconstructed. One of the key features of Saqqara's underground galleries is their length. Some corridors stretch for hundreds of meters, reaching deep underground. They connect chambers, niches, and halls, many of which were intended to house sarcophagi. These spaces are striking not so much for their decorative appeal as for their scale and strict geometry, emphasizing their functional and ritualistic nature. The catacombs of sacred animals occupy a special place in the gallery system. Egyptian religion attached sacred significance to animals, viewing them as earthly manifestations of the gods. At Saqqara, there were underground complexes containing thousands of mummified ibises, falcons, cats, and bulls. Enormous spaces were required to house them, leading to the creation of extensive galleries reminiscent of underground cities. These catacombs were not spontaneous. Their layout indicates that construction followed a pre-planned plan. The corridors are of uniform width, the niches are repeated with precise regularity, and the vaults were designed for long-term stability. All of this indicates a high level of engineering and an understanding of how to work with underground space. Saqqara's underground galleries are also associated with human burials. In some complexes, sarcophagi were housed in separate chambers, sealed with massive slabs. These burials were hidden from view and protected from outside interference. Their underground location enhanced the burial's sacred status, separating the world of the dead from that of the living, not only symbolically, but also physically. Interestingly, many galleries lack the paintings and inscriptions typical of above-ground tombs. This silence on the walls may indicate a different nature of these spaces. Perhaps they were intended not for individual memory, but for collective ritual or the storage of sacred objects, where personal identities were irrelevant. Archaeological research shows that some underground galleries were reused. Old corridors were widened, deepened, or adapted for new cults. This speaks to the continuity of the sacred space. Even with the change of dynasties and religious emphases, Saqqara's underground level retained its significance. The construction process has attracted particular attention from researchers. Underground work with limited light and ventilation required strict organization. Stone was carefully cut to prevent collapses, and the removed material had to be transported to the surface. All of this points to the existence of specialized work teams trained specifically in underground construction. The gallery's function was not limited to burials. Some corridors have unusual orientations and architectural features not directly related to the placement of sarcophagi. This has given rise to hypotheses about ritual processions, secret ceremonies, and rites of passage which took place away from the public eye. In Egyptian thought, the subterranean space was associated with the Duat, the world of the dead and transformation. The descent underground symbolized the sun's journey during the night and its subsequent rebirth. The Saqqara galleries could be seen as the physical embodiment of this mythological route, followed by the soul of the deceased. Over time, many galleries were filled with sand and debris. Some collapsed, while others were flooded by groundwater. This created additional difficulties for modern research. To this day, a significant portion of Saqqara's underground remains unexplored or known only from fragmentary data. Modern methods, including ground-penetrating radar and 3D scanning, make it possible to identify hidden voids without destroying the cultural layer. These studies indicate that previously unknown galleries and chambers may exist beneath the plateau. The scale of the subterranean architecture likely significantly exceeds what is currently known. The underground galleries of Saqqara change our understanding of the role of the necropolis. It was more than just a burial site, but a complex sacred system that operated for millennia. Ritual, engineering, and ideology merged here, creating a space where death was viewed as part of the cosmic order. The enigma of the galleries lies not only in their vastness, but also in their silence. They left almost no texts explaining their purpose. Their meaning must be reconstructed from the architecture, context, and religious beliefs. This makes every interpretation tentative and open to revision. The underground galleries of Saqqara remain one of the deepest layers of ancient Egyptian heritage. Hidden from tourist routes and public attention, they are home to a part of culture not intended for outside view. They are a space of mystery, transition, and prolonged ritual time. Ultimately, Saqqara underground is no less important than Saqqara above ground. Its galleries demonstrate that the ancient Egyptians thought vertically, constructing the world not only in breadth, but also in depth. It is there, in the silence of the stone corridors, that their concept of eternity is revealed, a concept that continues to raise questions today. The secret of Vincha, the Vincha mystery, is linked to one of the earliest and, at the same time, most controversial sign systems in human history. The Vincha culture existed in the Balkans during the Neolithic and early Chalcolithic periods, long before the established writing systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Therefore, any traces of symbolic recording of information in this context take on particular significance. The Vincha signs challenge established ideas about the origins of writing and the development of human thought. Vincha culture settlements were located in what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and neighboring regions. These were large, well-organized communities with developed agriculture, crafts, and exchange. Archaeological finds demonstrate a high level of social structure and the stability of settlements that existed for centuries. In this context, the emergence of symbols appears not to be accidental, but a natural stage in cultural development. Vincha signs are found on ceramics, figurines, bone objects, and stone plaques. They are characterized by their simple form, yet demonstrate stability and repeatability. They include lines, crosses, angles, grids, and more complex combinations. Some symbols appear singly, while others form sequences, which immediately raise the question of a system. The main intrigue is whether these signs are writing. If so, then Vincha predates Mesopotamia by 1,000 years or more. This radically alters the entire chronology of the history of writing. However, if the signs were merely symbols, markings, or ritualistic designations, their meaning remains different, but no less important for understanding Neolithic thought. Proponents of the early writing theory point to the repetition of symbols and their limited set. The same symbols, sometimes in similar combinations, have been found in different settlements. This may indicate the presence of stable meanings passed down from generation to generation. Furthermore, some sequences appear too structured to be random ornamentation. Opponents of this hypothesis emphasize the lack of long texts. All known Vinca inscriptions are extremely short, no more than a few characters long. This is insufficient for a full-fledged script. Furthermore, there is no certainty that the signs recorded language rather than abstract ideas or social markers. Without bilingual texts, decipherment remains impossible. The context of the finds also plays an important role. Signs are often found on ritual objects, especially anthropomorphic figurines. This suggests a sacred or magical purpose for the symbols. In this case, they could have been associated with cults, rituals, or ideas about fertility and protection, rather than with the administrative recording of information. However, the sacred and the written were rarely strictly separated in ancient cultures. Early forms of writing often arose in a religious context. Therefore, the ritual use of signs does not preclude their function as a means of transmitting information. On the contrary, it may indicate an early stage in the development of a sign system. The geographical distribution of the Vinca signs is particularly noteworthy. They are found across a vast territory, suggesting the cultural cohesion of the region. They are not a local phenomenon of a single settlement, but rather an element of a broader tradition. This widespread distribution requires mechanisms for transmission and learning, which in itself indicates the significance of the symbols. Chronologically, the Vinca culture existed during a period of active change. This was a time of population growth, increasing complexity of social relations, and development of crafts. Under these conditions, the need for symbolic systems to record affiliation, status, or ritual formulas increased. Signs could fulfill precisely this function, straddling the line between ornament and writing. The disappearance of the Vinca culture adds further depth to the mystery. Around the middle of the 5th millennium BC, its settlements declined. The reasons for this decline are not entirely clear. Along with the culture, the tradition of using signs disappeared. It was not directly continued by subsequent Balkan cultures, indicating a break in the transmission of knowledge. This gap is particularly significant. If Vinca truly possessed a form of writing, or proto-writing, then humanity has lost one of its earliest intellectual traditions. We have only fragments, devoid of context, and we cannot reconstruct their meaning. The Vinca mystery in this case becomes an example of how knowledge can disappear without leaving any direct heirs. Modern research uses statistical analysis and computer methods to study the structure of signs. These approaches show that the distribution of symbols is not random. Some signs are more common than others, and their combinations are subject to certain constraints. This strengthens the case for a systematic nature, but still does not provide a key to interpretation. It is also important that the Vinca signs are not accompanied by images that could serve as a clue. Unlike pictographic systems, there is no obvious connection between the symbol and the object. This indicates a high degree of abstraction, which in itself is a significant achievement for Neolithic society. The Vinca mystery also raises the question of the origins of symbolic thought. Even if the signs were not written, they demonstrate the ability to manipulate abstract symbols beyond direct visual correspondence. This is an important step in the development of human consciousness, preceding formalized writing. Some researchers view the Vinca signs as an element of social identification. They could have denoted group membership, status, or role in a ritual. In this case, the system would have been closed and understood only by initiates, which explains its disappearance along with the culture. The lack of direct analogies deepens the mystery. The Vinca symbols resemble neither Sumerian cuneiform nor Egyptian hieroglyphs. This indicates an independent developmental path. This independence makes Vinca particularly valuable for understanding the diversity of human cultural trajectories. The mystery of Vinca remains unsolved not because of a lack of effort, but because the living tradition has been lost. Without bearers of knowledge, signs become silent forms. We can describe them, classify them, and analyze them, but we cannot restore their voice. In this sense, Vincha is not just an archaeological mystery, but a symbol of the vulnerability of early forms of knowledge. It demonstrates that intellectual achievements can arise early and vanish completely, leaving no direct trace in history. This is precisely what makes the Vincha mystery one of the most profound and disturbing in ancient history. Tiwanaku Platforms. Tiwanaku is one of the most enigmatic archaeological sites in South America, and, without a doubt, one of the most undervalued in the global history of ancient civilizations. It is located on the high Andes Plateau near Lake Titicaca, at an altitude where the harsh climate and thin air make the very existence of large settlements problematic. Yet it was here that arose a culture that succeeded in creating monumental stone platforms, the architectural logic and purpose of which remain controversial. The Tiwanaku platforms are not a single structure. They are a system of massive stone foundations, terraces, and raised plazas on which temples, courtyards, and ritual spaces were located. They create the feeling of an artificially formed landscape where nature was subordinated to a strict design. Stone here is not simply a building material, but a means of organizing space and time. One of the key features of the Tiwanaku platforms is their scale. Some are hundreds of meters long and are constructed from enormous stone blocks, precisely fitted together. The stone was quarried over considerable distances, and its transportation through marshy and mountainous areas required complex logistics. This suggests a high level of labor organization and centralized control. The engineering precision of the platforms is astounding. The stone blocks have smooth surfaces, right angles, and repeating proportions. Many elements appear standardized, as if crafted from a single template. This creates the impression that construction followed a pre-planned design rather than a gradual buildup. The Akapana platform has attracted particular attention from researchers. It is a stepped structure resembling a pyramid, but also functions as a complex hydraulic engineering structure. A system of canals designed for the drainage and distribution of water has been discovered within the platform. In high-altitude conditions, where seasonal rainfall plays a crucial role, water control was a matter of survival and sacred order. Water in Tiwanaku had not only practical but also symbolic significance. Platforms were often oriented to interact with water flows, light, and shadows. This suggests they were used for rituals associated with the cycles of nature, rain, and fertility. The platform became a place where people came into contact with cosmic forces. No less mysterious is the Kalasasaya platform, a rectangular structure with massive vertical stones around its perimeter. Its architecture suggests astronomical functions. The arrangement of the stone elements allows for the recording of important moments in the solar cycle. This turns the platform into a kind of stone calendar embedded in the sacred landscape. The Tiwanaku platforms were not isolated objects. They formed a connected system where movement between levels had ritual significance. Ascent to the platform could symbolize approaching the divine world, and descent a return to earthly reality. This vertical thinking is characteristic of Andean cultures, but at Tiwanaku it reached a unique architectural form. The age of the platforms remains controversial. Conventional archaeology dates Tiwanaku's heyday to the first millennium CE. However, some elements appear older, and the scale and complexity of the structures cast doubt on such a late date. The problem is compounded by the lack of written sources, and radiocarbon dating allows for a wide range of interpretations. The disappearance of the Tiwanaku culture adds an additional aura of mystery to the platforms. The complex was abandoned around the beginning of the second millennium CE. The reasons for this are not fully understood. Climate change, associated with fluctuations in the level of Lake Titicaca, could have undermined the agricultural foundation of the society. For a culture closely tied to hydroelectric systems, such changes would have been critical. However, the disappearance of Tiwanaku was not accompanied by widespread destruction. The platforms were not destroyed, but simply fell into disuse. This creates a sense of the sudden abandonment of a sacred center, as if it had lost its significance. For subsequent cultures, Tiwanaku became a place of memory and myth, but not a living center. The platforms continued to influence the region's worldview. The Incas, who came later, viewed Tiwanaku as a place of creation. They did not destroy the ancient structures, but rather treated them with reverence. This suggests that the platform's sacred status persisted even after the disappearance of their creators. The technological aspects of the platform's construction remain a subject of debate. The absence of metal and wheels did not prevent the craftsmen from achieving high precision. The stone was worked with remarkable precision, and the joints between the blocks were minimal. Some elements have complex shapes with grooves and projections, the purpose of which is not fully understood. These forms are often interpreted as connecting elements, but their precision exceeds practical necessity. This suggests that the geometry had symbolic significance. The platform became more than just a foundation, but a coded space where form had meaning. Tiwanaku platforms also played a social role. They were places of gatherings, ceremonies, and likely initiations. The platform's space allowed for controlled access and visual perception. Those at the top occupied a privileged position relative to those below. Archaeological finds show that platforms were used to place ritual objects and sacrificial offerings. This confirms their central role in religious life. The platform was the point of intersection between the human and divine worlds, a place where cosmic order was maintained. Modern research at Tiwanaku faces limitations. Erosion, agriculture, and uncontrolled excavations have damaged the complex. However, new methods, including digital modeling, allow for a better understanding of the structure of the platforms and their relationship to the landscape. The Tiwanaku platforms remain key to understanding this civilization. They demonstrate that complex architectural and symbolic systems could arise in conditions that seem hostile to modern humans. The high altitude did not become an obstacle. On the contrary, it was integrated into a sacred model of the world. The mystery of the platforms lies not only in how they were constructed, but also in why this particular form became central. The platform is a place of separation, elevation, and control. In Tiwanaku, it became a universal architectural language, expressing power, knowledge, and connection to the cosmos. Today, the Tiwanaku platforms are perceived as silent witnesses to a vanished world. They offer no direct answers, but they raise questions that extend beyond regional history. Their scale and sophistication force us to reconsider our understanding of the capabilities of ancient societies. Ultimately, the Tiwanaku platforms are more than just ruins. They are a thought frozen in stone. They remind us that civilizations may vanish, but the structures they created continue to influence imagination and scientific inquiry, remaining part of a dialogue between the past and the present. The undeciphered Phaistos Disk. The undeciphered Phaistos Disk remains one of archaeology's most persistent and simultaneously most vexing mysteries, existing on the border between obvious artifact and complete meaninglessness. This small clay object, discovered in Crete, challenges conventional understanding of the development of writing, technology, and cultural relations during the Bronze Age. Unlike many other ancient texts, the Phaistos Disk defies partial or arbitrary interpretation, remaining almost completely silent. The disk was discovered in the early 20th century in the ruins of the Phaistos Palace complex. It was located in an underground chamber connected to the administrative part of the building. The very context of the find suggests that the object had a significance beyond everyday life. It was not an object lost by chance, but was located in a space associated with governance, ritual, or the storage of important information. The disk's shape is both simple and unusual. It's a round clay plate with symbols arranged in a spiral from the edge to the center. The symbols weren't hand-carved, but rather imprinted using individual stamps. This makes the disk unique, as it demonstrates the principle of a repeating set of symbols, reminiscent of a primitive form of printing. In an era when similar technologies are undocumented anywhere else, this seems particularly unusual. The disk's symbol system includes several dozen different symbols. These include human figures, heads, animals, plants, tools, and abstract forms. The repetition of symbols creates the impression of a structured text rather than a random collection of images. However, the length of this text is extremely short, making statistical analysis extremely difficult. The main problem with interpreting the Phaistos disk is its isolation. No other artifact with an identical system of symbols has been found. This deprives researchers of the opportunity to compare and test hypotheses. Unlike Linear A or Linear B, the Phaistos disk does not fit into any known tradition of the Aegean world. There are many hypotheses about the nature of the disk. Some researchers believe it to be a written form, recording a language, possibly Minoan. Others suggest it is a ritual text, a hymn, or a spell. Others view the disk as a calendar, a game, or even a commemorative object created for one-time use. None of these hypotheses has been conclusively confirmed. The manufacturing technology is particularly noteworthy. The use of stamps presupposes a pre-designed set of symbols and an understanding of the principle of their combination. This suggests the existence of a system rather than spontaneous creativity. However, the lack of other examples of this technology raises the question of why it has not become widespread. Some researchers have questioned the disk's authenticity. It was suggested that it could be a forgery or an experiment by the archaeologist himself. However, analysis of the clay and the conditions of its discovery do not support this theory. Most experts accept the disk as genuine, which only exacerbates the problem of its interpretation. The cultural context of Bronze Age Crete also complicates the situation. The Minoan civilization exhibits a high level of organization, art, and trade. In such a society, the existence of an experimental form of information recording is entirely possible. However, the lack of evidence for its development or continuation remains unexplained. The spiral arrangement of symbols is significant. This method of writing differs from linear texts and may indicate ritual reading or a specific sequence of perception. The movement from the edge to the center may symbolize a path, a cycle, or a transition consistent with religious interpretations. The lack of decipherment of the Phaistos disk highlights the vulnerability of ancient knowledge. If this object does indeed contain text, then we are dealing with completely lost information that cannot be restored without a key. This is a rare case where a written artifact fails to provide even a rough understanding of its contents. Modern analysis methods, including computational linguistics and modeling, can reveal patterns but not meanings. They show that symbol sequences are not chaotic, but they do not reveal their meaning. Without knowledge of the language and context, any interpretation remains speculative. The Phaistos disk also raises the question of how many similar objects might have existed. Perhaps we are dealing not with a unique phenomenon, but with the sole surviving example of a lost tradition. Organic materials, such as wood or wax, could have contained similar texts that have not survived. What's also interesting is that the disk shows no obvious signs of use. It's neither worn nor damaged, which may indicate limited or symbolic use. Perhaps it was created for a single event or ritual, after which it lost its relevance. The undecipherability of the Phaistos disk makes it a symbol of the limits of knowledge. It reminds us that archaeology is not always able to reconstruct the meaning of the past. Even with the availability of a material object and modern technology, some forms of information remain forever sealed. In this sense, the Phaistos disk differs from other mysteries of writing. We can't even determine what exactly we don't understand: the language, the symbolism, or the very principle of writing. It remains an object that exists but doesn't speak. The significance of the disk lies not only in attempts to decipher it, but also in the fact that it demonstrates alternative paths of cultural development. It shows that innovations could arise and disappear without leaving traces in subsequent traditions. Today, the Phaistos disk is perceived as an intellectual challenge. It forces scholars to acknowledge the limitations of their methods and approach reconstructions with caution. Its silence is a reminder that the past does not have to be fully accessible. The undeciphered Phaistos disk remains one of the few artifacts that provides neither support nor direction. It doesn't fit into known patterns and doesn't confirm existing theories. This is precisely why it continues to generate interest and debate, remaining one of the purest mysteries of the ancient world. Disappearance of the Garamantids. The Garamantids were one of the most unusual civilizations of the ancient world, managing to create a stable state in the heart of the Sahara. Their culture existed in a place where, according to modern understanding, a complex society could not survive without external support. Yet the Garamantids not only survived, but also developed a sophisticated system of settlement, trade, and governance, traces of which can still be found beneath the desert sands. Their disappearance remains one of the most underestimated mysteries of ancient history. Ancient authors mention the Garamantids as a people living far to the south beyond the familiar Mediterranean world. They describe them as skilled farmers, warriors, and traders who controlled caravan routes across the desert. These accounts were long considered exaggerated or legendary, as archaeological evidence was almost non-existent. Only in recent decades has it become clear that the ancient descriptions were much closer to reality than previously assumed. The center of the Garamantian state was in the Fezzan region of modern-day Libya. Here, archaeologists have discovered the remains of cities, fortresses, cemeteries, and, most importantly, a complex system of underground water channels. These channels allowed water to be extracted from deep aquifers and irrigated during extreme drought. Without this technology, the existence of the Garamantian civilization would have been impossible. Underground canals dug for tens of kilometers testify to a high level of engineering expertise and long-term planning. Their construction required precise calculations, teamwork, and constant maintenance. This suggests the existence of an organized government and social structure capable of managing resources and people. The Garamantids were not nomads, as was long believed, but a sedentary society with urban centers. The Garamantid economy relied on agriculture and control of trade routes. They cultivated grain, dates, and other crops using irrigation, and also acted as intermediaries in the trans-Saharan trade. Routes connecting the Mediterranean with deep Africa passed through their lands. This made the state an important element of the ancient world, albeit located on its periphery. Despite their successes, Garamantian society was extremely dependent on ecological balance. Water was a key resource, and the entire system relied on the stability of underground springs. Any changes in climate or aquifer levels could have catastrophic consequences. Many researchers believe this factor is the primary explanation for the disappearance of the Garamantians. Paleoclimatic data indicate a gradual increase in aridity in the Sahara in the first centuries AD. This process was not instantaneous, but steadily worsened living conditions. Underground canals, designed for a specific water level, gradually lost their effectiveness. Depletion of aquifers meant declining harvests and increasing social tensions. However, environmental factors don't explain everything. The Garamantids were in contact with the Roman Empire, which periodically clashed with them. The Romans conducted military expeditions deep into the desert, destroyed settlements, and disrupted trade links. Although these campaigns did not lead to the immediate destruction of the state, they weakened its economy and undermined stability. Over time, the trade structure also changed. New routes could bypass the Garamantid territories, reducing their role as intermediaries. Losing control over caravans meant a loss of income and political influence. For a state that depended on transit and irrigation, this was a double blow. Archaeological evidence shows that the disappearance of the Garamantids was not sudden. Settlements gradually declined, cities lost population, and irrigation systems deteriorated. It was a slow process, spread over several centuries. The people did not disappear suddenly, but left the region, adapting to new conditions or migrating to more favorable areas. Interestingly, the disappearance of the Garamantids left almost no trace in written sources. Ancient authors cease mentioning them as if the people had vanished into the desert. This silence heightens the sense of mystery and highlights the vulnerability of civilizations located outside the centers of written tradition. The disappearance of the Garamantids also demonstrates that complex societies could exist in extreme conditions, but their resilience was limited. A high level of engineering did not guarantee longevity when natural and economic conditions changed. Modern research continues to reveal new details of their history. Satellite images reveal canals and settlements hidden beneath the sand, expanding our understanding of the scale of their empire. These discoveries demonstrate that the Garamantids were far more influential and numerous than previously thought. However, they also highlight the scale of their loss, as much of their world remains inaccessible. The disappearance of the Garamantidae is significant not only as a regional mystery. It demonstrates the fragility of human systems under environmental pressure. Even with technology and organization, societies can prove powerless against slow but inexorable environmental change. Today, the Garamantids are returning to scholarly discourse as a fully fledged civilization, not a marginal desert people. Their history forces us to reconsider our understanding of the boundaries of the possible in the ancient world. It demonstrates that civilizations could arise and disappear far from their traditional centers, leaving behind only traces buried beneath the sand. The disappearance of the Garamantids remains a case of quiet extinction, devoid of catastrophe or legend. There are no tales of a final battle or sudden destruction. There is only a gradual decline, recorded in layers of sand and abandoned canals. It is precisely this invisibility that makes their disappearance particularly disturbing. Ultimately, the story of the Garamantids is one of human-environment interaction pushed to its limits. They succeeded in transforming the desert into a habitable space, but the cost of this success proved too high in the long term. Their disappearance is a reminder that even the most inventive societies remain dependent on the fragile balance of nature and resources. Pillars of Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe was one of the most radical archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century, completely changing our understanding of how and when the first complex societies emerged. This complex, located in the southeast of modern-day Turkey, dates back to an era before ceramics, metals, and advanced agriculture. Nevertheless, it was here that massive stone structures were erected, the central elements of which were monumental T-shaped pillars, which have no direct parallels in later cultures. The Göbekli Tepe pillars are astonishing simply by their existence. Each one is carved from a single limestone block and reaches several meters in height. Their mass is measured in tens of tons, and their surface finish demonstrates a high level of stone-cutting skill. For a hunter-gatherer society, as people of that time were traditionally considered, such efforts would have seemed impossible. This is why the pillars have become key to redefining the entire picture of early human history. The shape of the pillars is strictly standardized. The T-shaped silhouette is repeated in all the main structures of the complex. This shape is not random and likely had a symbolic meaning. The horizontal crossbar can be interpreted as shoulders, and the vertical section as a torso. This assumption is reinforced by the presence of relief images of arms, belts, and loincloths on some of the pillars. Thus, the pillars can be viewed as abstract anthropomorphic figures. The reliefs adorning the pillars present a distinct mystery. They depict animals, snakes, foxes, boars, birds, and scorpions. These images are executed with astonishing expressiveness and attention to detail. However, the scenes do not appear narrative in the traditional sense. Rather, they resemble a symbolic set of images, the meaning of which was clear to their creators but is lost to us. It's important to note that the animal images do not reflect the everyday reality of hunting. Many of the species depicted were dangerous or rare. This indicates their symbolic rather than utilitarian nature. The animals could have served as totems, symbols of group identity, or elements of a mythological worldview. In this case, the pillars became carriers of sacred knowledge. The pillars were always arranged within circular or oval stone structures. At the center of each circle stood a pair of particularly large pillars, oriented toward each other. The remaining pillars were arranged around the perimeter, forming an enclosed space. This arrangement creates the feeling of an organized ritual space where the central pair played a special role. The purpose of these central pillars remains a subject of debate. They vary significantly in size and craftsmanship. They may have symbolized mythological ancestors, deities, or abstract forces. Their orientation toward one another creates the impression of a dialogue or interaction taking place within the sacred center of the structure. Of particular significance is the fact that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement in the traditional sense. No traces of long-term habitation, hearths, or outbuildings have been found here. This means that people came here with a purpose, likely from different locations. The pillars became the focal point of collective activity, extending beyond everyday life. The construction of the pillars required enormous effort. The stone was quarried nearby, but its processing and transportation still required the coordination of a large number of people. This suggests the existence of a social organization capable of mobilizing labor without the coercion typical of later states. It was likely the ritual significance of the pillars that ensured such mobilization. Göbekli Tepe has upended our understanding of the sequence of civilization's development. Previously, it was believed that agriculture emerged first, followed by food surpluses, and only then rituals and monumental construction. Here, we see the opposite picture. Pillars and ritual spaces appeared before sustainable agriculture. This suggests that ritual itself may have been the factor that led to sedentarization and the development of agriculture. Another mystery is the deliberate burying of the complex. After a certain period of use, the Göbekli Tepe structures were carefully covered with earth. This does not resemble destruction or abandonment. Rather, it was a deliberate act of enclosing the space. The pillars were not destroyed, but rather preserved. The reasons for this remain unclear. A possible explanation lies in a shift in worldview. If social or ritual practices lost their relevance, the space might be closed off to preserve its sacred integrity. In this case, covering it up was a form of respect, not denial. The pillars were preserved as a reminder of the past but were no longer used. The age of the pillars makes them particularly significant. They were erected several millennia before Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. This means that complex symbolic thinking and the ability to construct monuments emerged much earlier than previously thought. Göbekli Tepe bears witness to the deep antiquity of human spiritual culture. The stone processing technology also raises questions. The pillar surfaces are smooth, the edges are clear, and the reliefs are executed with high precision. In the absence of metal, this required sophisticated processing techniques and extensive training. This suggests the existence of specialists whose skills were passed on and refined. The Göbekli Tepe pillars bear no written symbols. However, their form and images can be viewed as a visual language. This is a symbolic language accessible to ritual participants. It did not record speech, but conveyed ideas, images, and social meanings. In this sense, the pillars can be seen as an alternative form of recording collective memory. Modern research suggests that Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader cultural zone. Similar but smaller structures have been discovered elsewhere in the region. This suggests that the pillars were not a unique anomaly, but rather part of a tradition shared by several groups. However, it was at Göbekli Tepe that this tradition reached its highest concentration. The scale and complexity of the complex made it a focal point. The pillars became focal points around which a shared space of meaning formed, uniting disparate communities. The significance of the pillars extends far beyond archaeology. They force us to rethink our understanding of human nature. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that the desire for symbol, ritual, and collective action can precede economic necessity. Humans united not only for survival, but also for meaning. Today, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe are perceived as silent witnesses to a moment when human thought made a qualitative leap. They don't tell history directly, but their presence changes the very structure of the questions we ask of the past. This is precisely where their unique value lies. The sunken city of Thonis Herakleion. The sunken city of Thonis Herakleion is one of those rare cases where ancient texts, myths, and archaeology converge, confirming the reality of a place long considered semi-legendary. Situated in the Nile Delta, the city served for centuries as the main sea entrance to Egypt from the Mediterranean. Its disappearance beneath the waves was not the result of a single event, but a chain of natural and historical processes that transformed a vibrant port into an underwater ruin. Ancient sources mentioned the city under various names. The Egyptians called it Thonis, and the Greeks Herakleion. This dual name reflects its unique status as a borderland between the Egyptian and Greek worlds. Trade routes, religious cults, and political interests converged here, making the city more than just a port, but a key hub for international contacts. Thonis Herakleion's location in the Nile Delta determined its fate. The city was built on a system of islands and canals, linked by bridges and docks. Water was an integral part of the city's structure, providing transportation, trade, and defense. However, it was precisely this aquatic environment that made the city vulnerable to changes in the natural balance. Archaeological finds show that Thonis Herakleion was a wealthy and well-organized city. It housed temples, warehouses, wharves, residential areas, and administrative buildings. Religious buildings dedicated to Egyptian gods, including Amun, occupied a special place. These temples served not only as religious centers, but also as symbols of the legitimacy of power and control over trade. The Greek presence in the city grew stronger over time. Merchants, sailors, and ambassadors from the Greek world founded an entry point into Egypt. This created a unique cultural environment where traditions, languages, and rituals intertwined. Thonis Herakleion was a place where Egypt entered into dialogue with the outside world. However, the Nile Delta is a dynamic and unstable environment. Rainfall, floods, and tectonic processes constantly reshape the landscape. The city stood on water-saturated soils, which could become unstable under certain conditions. Over time, this became a key factor in the catastrophe. Research shows that Thonis Herakleion experienced a series of earthquakes and underwater landslides. These events led to soil liquefaction, causing the massive stone structures to slowly sink into the water. This was not an instantaneous flood, but a gradual process that lasted for decades. The Nile's floods also played a role. Shifting riverbeds and increased water loads weakened the foundations of buildings. Canals that had once served as the city's arteries became sources of destruction. Gradually, entire neighborhoods became uninhabitable, and the population began to abandon them. Despite deteriorating conditions, the city continued to function. Archaeological evidence suggests attempts to strengthen the structures and adapt to the new conditions. This suggests that the disappearance of Thonis Herakleion was not sudden or unexpected for its residents. They fought to preserve the city as long as they could. The turning point came when a combination of factors made further existence impossible. The ground finally lost its stability, and a significant portion of the city sank underwater. Temples, statues, and piers were submerged in the marine environment, where they were eventually covered by silt and sand. After Thonis Herakleion disappeared, its functions were transferred to other ports, primarily Alexandria. the city was forgotten and its name gradually became the subject of controversy and legend. Ancient authors mentioned it, but without specifying its exact location, which eventually gave rise to doubts about its actual existence. The modern discovery of the city was made possible by the development of underwater archaeology. In the late 20th century, explorations in Abu Qir Bay uncovered the remains of structures, statues, and household items confirming the existence of Thonis Herakleion. These discoveries caused a sensation, as the city was remarkably well preserved. Massive stone blocks, statues of gods and rulers, as well as anchors and ship parts, were discovered underwater. All of this attests to the port's high activity and its importance for maritime trade. The city was not a peripheral settlement, but played a key role in the region's economy. Religious artifacts are particularly significant. The temples of Thonis Herakleion were important religious centers, and their flooding was perceived as a serious blow to Egypt's sacred geography. In ancient thought, the destruction of the temples could be interpreted as a sign of the loss of the god's favor, heightening the drama of the event. The city's disappearance underwater was not accompanied by vivid historical chronicles. It was a silent catastrophe occurring gradually and without a single decisive moment. This is why Thonis Herakleion disappeared from memory, leaving no clear legend of its demise. The story of the sunken city highlights the vulnerability of coastal civilizations. Even its advanced infrastructure and wealth could not protect Thonis Herakleion from the forces of nature. Its demise was the result of the interaction of humans and an unstable environment, where any miscalculation had long-term consequences. Today, Thonis Herakleion is perceived as an underwater archive. Its ruins allow us to study the city's life in detail, inaccessible to many above-ground monuments ravaged by time and people. While water destroyed the city, it also preserved it. The sunken city has become a reminder that the boundaries between land and sea are not fixed. Where life once teemed, the seabed now lies. This forces us to rethink the resilience of ancient civilizations and their ability to withstand natural changes. Ultimately, Thonis Herakleion is a story not only of the demise of a city, but also of a shift in eras. Its disappearance symbolizes the end of one worldview and the transition to another, in which the centers of power and trade have shifted. What remained underwater was not just a city, but an entire layer of history, rediscovered only millennia later. The mystery of Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük occupies a special place among humanity's oldest settlements because it challenges conventional notions of what an early civilization should look like. It is not a city in the classical sense, not a temple center, and not a fortified capital. It is a dense, multi-layered Neolithic settlement that existed in what is now Turkey and reached significant proportions long before the advent of states, writing, and monumental architecture as we know it. Çatalhöyük emerged during a period when humanity was just transitioning from a nomadic lifestyle to sedentary agriculture. Nevertheless, its size is astonishing. At its peak, thousands of people lived here, concentrated in a relatively small area. Such a concentrated population required stable social mechanisms, but archaeology reveals no signs of centralized authority, palaces, or administrative buildings. The architecture of Çatalhöyük is one of the settlement's greatest mysteries. The houses were closely packed together, with no streets in the traditional sense. Movement took place on the roofs, and the dwellings were entered through openings in the ceiling. This structure creates the impression of a single architectural complex in which the individual houses acted as cells within a larger organism. The absence of streets and public squares raises questions about social organization. Where did gatherings, information exchange, and rituals take place? Archaeological evidence shows that a significant portion of social and ritual life took place inside houses. The home simultaneously served as a space for living, remembering, and performing sacred acts. The interiors of Çatalhöyük's houses are rich in symbolism, The walls were decorated with paintings depicting animals, hunting scenes, and abstract motifs. In some rooms, reliefs of bullheads and horns were found embedded directly into the walls. These elements indicate a complex belief system closely linked to everyday life. Funeral practices present a particular mystery. The dead were buried under the floors of houses, often in the same rooms where their relatives continued to live. This speaks to a specific attitude toward death and ancestors. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead in Çatalhöyük was blurred, and the memory of ancestors was part of everyday life. Interestingly, the houses do not vary in size or wealth sufficiently to suggest a pronounced social hierarchy. Archaeologists have found no obvious signs of an elite, a ruling class, or specialized administrative functions. This makes Çatalhöyük an example of a relatively egalitarian society with a high degree of social integration. The settlement's economy was based on agriculture, hunting, and gathering. Residents grew grain crops, raised domestic animals, and continued to actively hunt. This combination suggests a transitional nature to the society. However, the settlement scale suggests the high efficiency of these practices and the ability to support a large population. The mystery lies in how such a society remained stable over centuries. The absence of overt power structures does not mean a lack of order. Social norms, rituals, and collective beliefs likely played a key role in maintaining equilibrium. Religious imagery embedded in homes may have served as a means of social control and identity. Researchers have paid particular attention to the depictions of female figures, often interpreted as fertility symbols. However, a clear dominant female cult cannot be identified. Çatalhöyük exhibits a complex and multi-layered symbolism, where various images coexist without a clear hierarchical order. The settlement existed in one place for a very long time, gradually growing in layers. Old houses were torn down and new ones were built in their place, forming a hill. This process created a continuity of space and memory. Life literally unfolded on top of the lives of previous generations, strengthening the sense of connection with the past. The disappearance of Çatalhöyük also remains a mystery. The settlement was not destroyed by catastrophe or conquest. It gradually emptied. The reasons for this process are not fully understood. Possible factors include climate change, resource depletion, or the transformation of social networks. It's important to note that the departure from Çatalhöyük did not mean the disappearance of its culture. People likely dispersed to other regions, taking with them elements of their worldview and practices. However, the very format of such a dense settlement was never exactly replicated, which underscores its uniqueness. Çatalhöyük challenges the idea that complex societies necessarily require rigid hierarchies and centralized authority. He demonstrates an alternative developmental path based on collective identity, ritual, and symbolic space. This society was complex not because of its institutions of power, but because of the density of social and cultural ties. Modern research utilizes interdisciplinary approaches, including DNA, isotope, and microtrace analysis, to better understand the lives of the settlement's inhabitants. These findings confirm high mobility, dietary diversity, and complex kinship networks, reinforcing the idea of Çatalhöyük as a dynamic and adaptive society. The mystery of Çatalhöyük lies not in the lack of information, but in its abundance. We know many details, but they don't fit into a familiar pattern. The settlement seems to defy classification, forcing us to reconsider the very categories we use to describe early civilizations. Çatalhöyük is a reminder that human history was not linear. Different forms of organization could arise, persist, and disappear without leaving a direct continuation. This Neolithic world was complex, rich, and symbolically rich, despite the absence of the technologies we consider the hallmarks of civilization. Ultimately, Çatalhöyük remains one of archaeology's most profound questions. It demonstrates that humans sought collective life, meaning, and symbolism long before the emergence of cities and states. Its mystery lies in its being simultaneously simple and incredibly complex, familiar, and yet utterly alien to our understanding. The disappearance of Moche. The Moche civilization, which existed on the northern coast of modern-day Peru, was one of the most distinctive and controversial cultures of pre-Columbian America. It left no written texts, but its world speaks through architecture, ceramics, and ritual complexes. This is why the disappearance of the Moche is perceived not as a sudden collapse, but as a complex and multi-layered process, traces of which can be seen in material culture, landscape, and symbolism. The Moche developed in conditions of extreme natural instability. The narrow coastal strip, sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean and deserts, required precise water management. Life here was only possible thanks to a vast system of irrigation canals that irrigated fields and supported agriculture. This dependence on water made the society simultaneously highly organized and vulnerable. Moche architecture demonstrates a high level of social and ritual organization. Enormous temple complexes such as Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna dominated the landscape. Constructed from millions of clay bricks, they served as centers of religious, political, and likely judicial life. These structures not only reflected elite power, but also formed sacred spaces within which world order was maintained. Moche art is particularly valuable for understanding their society. Realistic ceramics depict scenes of everyday life, war, sacrifice, and ritual. These images reveal a world saturated with violence, symbolism, and strict hierarchy. Authority, religion, and military force were closely intertwined, forming a stable yet rigid system. Ritual sacrifices played a key role in maintaining this order. Archaeological finds confirm that human sacrifices were performed regularly and had a strictly defined ritual character. These practices were likely aimed at appeasing the gods and ensuring favorable natural conditions. However, such a system required constant confirmation of its effectiveness. Climate catastrophes are considered one of the key reasons for the Moche's disappearance. Paleoclimatic data indicate a series of extreme events associated with the El Niño phenomenon. These events resulted in devastating floods followed by prolonged droughts. For a society entirely dependent on irrigation, such fluctuations were devastating. Floods destroyed canals and silted up fields, making them unsuitable for farming. The droughts that followed deprived society of the opportunity to recover. In the face of repeated disasters, traditional rituals could lose their authority. If sacrifices and ceremonies no longer ensured stability, faith in the existing order began to crumble. Archaeological evidence shows increasing signs of social tension in the late Moche period. In some regions, temples were destroyed and ritual practices changed. This may indicate internal conflicts, competition for resources, and a weakening of central authority. Society, previously seemingly monolithic, began to fragment. It's important to note that the Moche were not a unified state. They were a collection of regional centers, linked by shared traditions but maintaining autonomy. This structure allowed for flexibility during favorable times, but in times of crisis, it could accelerate disintegration. Each region responded to disasters in its own unique way, which undermined the overall cultural stability. The military aspect also plays a role in understanding the disappearance of the Moche. Pottery and fortified settlements attest to conflicts between different groups. Given the scarcity of water and food, such conflicts could have become persistent. Violence, previously ritualized and controlled, could have spiraled out of symbolic control. The disappearance of the Moche was not sudden. The process occurred at different rates in different valleys. Some centers were abandoned sooner, while others remained active longer. This points to a complex and protracted transition, not a sudden catastrophe. People adapted, changed their lifestyle, and migrated. It's important to emphasize that the disappearance of the Moche does not mean the disappearance of the population. Descendants of this culture continued to live in the region, forming new societies such as the Sican and Chimu. Many elements of their worldview, art, and technology were inherited and transformed. However, the system we call Moche never recovered. The mystery of the Moche's disappearance lies in a combination of external and internal factors. Climate disasters were a catalyst, but not the only cause. A social structure based on rigid hierarchy and ritual violence may have proved inflexible in the face of prolonged crisis. When the symbolic order ceased to function, society lost its internal support. Modern research shows that changes in iconography occurred during the late Moche period. Some sacrificial scenes disappeared or were transformed. This may reflect attempts to rethink rituals and seek new forms of legitimization of power. However, these changes proved insufficient to preserve the integrity of the culture. The disappearance of the Moche highlights the importance of environmental context in the history of civilizations. Even highly developed societies possessing sophisticated technologies and rich symbolism remain dependent on natural conditions. When this balance is disrupted too often and too severely, social structures begin to collapse. The Moche story also demonstrates that art can be an important source of information about crisis. Their ceramics capture not only idealized images, but also tension, fear, and violence. In this sense, material culture becomes a chronicle of disintegration, albeit encoded in symbols. Today, the disappearance of the Moche is perceived not as a mystery with a single answer, but as an example of the complex dynamics between nature, society, and worldview. It is a story of adaptation, resistance, and ultimately, transformation. The culture did not perish instantly, but it lost its form, giving way to new social configurations. Ultimately, the Moche remind us that civilizations can be both incredibly inventive and fragile. Their disappearance is not a failure, but rather a reflection of the limits of a particular worldview. This is why the Moche story continues to captivate and offers an important lesson for understanding humanity's past. Stone terraces of the Jordan Valley. The stone terraces of the Jordan Valley are among those archaeological phenomena long regarded as secondary landscape features rather than key to understanding the ancient societies of the Near East. They do not impress with the monumentality of temples or the mystery of written symbols, yet these terraces became the foundation for the survival and development of human communities in one of the most complex and volatile regions of the ancient world. Their mystery lies in the combination of utility and hidden social depth. The Jordan Valley is a unique natural area where sharp elevation changes, limited water resources, and an unstable climate posed significant challenges to agriculture. Under these conditions, stone terraces became a way to transform the natural terrain into manageable space. They helped retain soil, distribute moisture, and create areas suitable for growing crops on the hillsides and foothills. The terraces were built from local stone and formed a stepped system that followed the contours of the terrain. Their construction required significant collective effort and a precise understanding of the behavior of water and soil. A miscalculation could lead to the collapse of the entire system during heavy rains or droughts. This suggests that terracing was not a spontaneous process, but rather based on accumulated experience and the transfer of knowledge between generations. One of the key features of the Jordan Valley terraces is their antiquity. Archaeological research suggests that some systems may have originated in prehistoric times and remained in use, with modifications, for millennia. This makes the terraces a unique chronotope of human presence, with each layer reflecting a stage of adaptation to changing conditions. The terraces were not isolated objects. They were part of a broader economic system that included canals, reservoirs, and settlements. Together, these elements formed a landscape completely transformed by humans. This level of intervention in nature testifies to a high degree of social coordination and collective responsibility. The mystery of stone terraces is that they are rarely mentioned in written sources, despite their vital importance. While ancient texts focus on cities, temples, and rulers, terraces remain in the shadows. This creates a gap between the real foundation of the economy and its ideological reflection. Terraces were a foundation, but not a symbol of power. The social significance of terraces is difficult to overestimate. Their maintenance required constant labor and coordinated action. The destruction of one part of the system could affect the entire community. This contributed to the formation of collective norms regulating the distribution of water, land, and labor. Thus, terraces were not only an agricultural tool, but also a mechanism for social integration. In the Jordan Valley, terracing allowed for the cultivation of a variety of crops, including grains, grapes, and olives. This created a stable economic base and reduced dependence on climate fluctuations. However, this system remained vulnerable to extreme events, such as prolonged droughts or sudden changes in rainfall patterns. Archaeological evidence shows that periods of terrace decline often coincide with settlement crises. Abandoned terraces quickly collapse as the stone walls become unstable without constant maintenance. This makes terracing an indicator of social vitality. When social bonds weaken, this landscape element is the first to disappear. Interestingly, many terraces continue to be used by different cultures over the centuries. They survived the transitions of peoples, languages, and religions. This demonstrates the universality of terraces as a technology and the continuity of knowledge that could be transmitted, even without written records. Terraces became a common foundation for different worldviews. The question of labor organization remains a mystery. Who made decisions about building new terraces? How was responsibility for their maintenance distributed? The absence of clear administrative centers in some areas suggests that governance may have been carried out at the community level, without a rigid hierarchy. This makes terracing an example of decentralized yet effective resource management. Stone terraces also influence the perception of space. They transformed the chaotic terrain into an ordered structure where each level had its own purpose. This landscape fostered a unique sense of belonging and connection to the land. The terraces were the result of a long-term interaction between humans and the environment, not a one-time architectural design. Over time, climate and political changes led to the degradation of terrace systems. During periods of instability or migration, their maintenance ceased. This led to soil erosion and decreased land productivity. Thus, the disappearance of terraces often accompanied broader social transformations. Modern studies of the Jordan Valley employ landscape archaeology and remote sensing techniques, allowing traces of terraces to be identified even where they have been almost completely destroyed. These data indicate that the scale of terracing was much greater than previously thought. Humans transformed the valley systematically and deliberately. Stone terraces challenge the notion of progress as a linear process. Many ancient systems were so effective that their principles are still used today. Modern agricultural practices in the region often rely on the restoration or adaptation of ancient terraces, emphasizing their sustainability. The mystery of the Jordan Valley terraces also lies in their silence. They bear no images or texts, nor do they speak of gods or rulers. Their message lies in form and function. This is an archaeology of work, not symbolism, and that is why it has long remained on the fringes of attention. Yet it is precisely these structures that allow us to understand the true foundations of ancient civilizations. Without terraces, there would be no surplus. Without surplus, no cities and temples. Stone steps laid on slopes became the foundation of complex societies, although they themselves were rarely perceived as significant. The stone terraces of the Jordan Valley are a testament to the human capacity for long-term planning and collective action. They require time, patience, and cooperation. Their creation and maintenance are impossible without strong social ties and trust within the community. Ultimately, terraces represent a frozen dialogue between man and nature. They don't conquer the landscape, but adapt to it, working with its form rather than against it. This is precisely their profound meaning and the reason for their longevity. The enigma of the Jordan Valley's stone terraces is that they were simultaneously simple and incredibly complex. Simple in form, yet complex in their social and environmental context. They remind us that the greatest achievements of antiquity are often hidden not in stone monuments, but in the subtle structures that make life possible. The stories of vanished cultures, sunken cities, and mysterious structures reveal that humanity's past is far more complex and fragile than it seems. Civilizations arose in extreme conditions, created complex systems, and vanished, leaving only fragments of memory. These traces offer no ready answers, but they serve as a reminder that development is never linear, and resilience always has its limits.